This is Audible.
Blackstone Audio presents Strange Worlds, short fiction by Jonathan Mayberry. This book is read by Ray Porter. The Things That Live in Cages. 1. Dylan saw the punch floating toward him and knew that there wasn't a goddamn thing he could do about it. The Cuban kid had battered his arms for 3 rounds, and Dylan could no more raise his hands to block that punch than he could have sprouted wings and flown away. His legs were overcooked macaroni, and his heart was beating against the walls of his chest like a hummingbird trying to push through the windows of a burning house. The punch was going to end him. He knew it. Time seemed to have slowed down so he could appreciate that fact. Dylan's corner man was screaming at him to block. The crowd was yelling like they were at the Roman circus. Mike Dillon couldn't see at all out of his left eye, and his right was smeared with sweat, blood, and Vaseline. Dylan tried to duck his head down, to take the punch on his forehead instead of his nose. That might give him a chance. If the Cuban kid busted a couple of hand bones, then maybe his corner guy might toss a towel into the ring, or the ref might stop the fight. Yeah, and maybe bright blue pigs will fly out of my ass, thought Dylan. Even so, he closed his one good eye and ducked. He could feel the exact moment when time snapped back to full speed. The fist seemed to fill the whole world. There was a huge sound inside his head. It was so loud that it muffled the sound of the Cuban kid's knuckles hitting bruised flesh and cracked bone. Dylan felt the shock moving at an angle from the point of impact through his sinuses and eye sockets, past the back of his mouth, the surge of power shifting his head, tilting the opening at the back of his skull toward the brain stem. There was a cracking sound. Sharp, wet, deep. Dylan knew that it wasn't his skull. It wasn't his jaw. The sound was immediately followed by a feeling of immense emptiness, as if his entire body had been hollowed out, nerves and skin and bone and blood. Everything below the level of his collarbones became a blank. "I'm dead," said Dylan. Or maybe he thought it. He couldn't feel himself fall. He didn't feel the flat of his back hit the mat. He didn't feel anything. All he was aware of was a huge black mouth gaping wide as death leaned forward to swallow him whole. "You're awake," said a voice. "Good." Dylan wasn't sure that the voice was real, mostly because he was pretty sure that he was asleep, or maybe unconscious was the right word. It's not like he drifted off in his lazy boy in front of the big screen. He hadn't opened his eyes, though, so he wondered how anyone could tell he was awake. His mind was filled with gutter water and debris. His thoughts were broken things that lay scattered around inside his head. He knew that he'd been in a fight. This wasn't the first time he'd awakened in a hospital bed. A fight. Sure. Okay. But which fight? Who beat him this bad? And how bad was it? He could feel his head, which hurt so much that Dylan wanted to let the darkness take him back down into the dim nothingness. He tried to move his arms. Nothing. His legs. Nothing. Shit, he thought. But beneath that thought there was a second and less articulate thought. It was more of a sense of how bad things might be, but his mind rebelled against putting it into words. "Got to think," he told himself. "Got to get my shit together and think this through." Dylan lay there, letting some internal hand flick on the light switches one by one. He didn't try to speak. He wasn't sure he could. There was a soft ping, ping sound behind him. He knew that sound. One of those hospital machines that never seem to do anything but make soft noises. There was a dull pain in the back of his right hand. He didn't need to look to identify that. IV. Fuck. Unless he was dead, and this was some kind of holdover memory. Mr. Dillon. The voice again. Male. He could tell that much. Nobody he knew. If it was St. Peter waiting for him to make his case for entrance through the pearly gates, then Dillon wasn't interested. Dillon didn't want to have to explain to St. Peter that he didn't believe in any of that shit. Heaven, wings, halos, paradise, none of that shit. And if it wasn't St. Pete and it was that other guy, then fuck you to him too. Dillon did believe in hell. And as far as he was concerned, hell was better known as Trenton, New Jersey. Any other place, even if it was all fire and brimstone and shit, would be an improvement. There was a rustling sound, like newspapers. Whoever was there didn't speak again, and Dillon figured the guy was reading the paper. Fine, whatever. Hope he had a comfortable seat, because Dillon wasn't in any hurry to wake up and rejoin the world. Any world. He settled back and let the darkness take him again. His last thought before he passed out again was that nothing hurt. Everything should have hurt, though, so that was a little weird. The Cuban kid had beaten the shit out of him for 7 2-minute rounds. Dillon had gotten 2 good shots in, a roundhouse kick to the ribs and a spinning back fist that emptied the kid's eyes for a few seconds, but that was back in round 1. Dillon had come out hard and heavy the way he always did. That was his thing. He wrapped up the fight in the first round, or he generally got his ass handed to him. Different when he was young, but Dillon was a lot of miles away from anyone's definition of young. Cage fighting was not a sport for middle-aged guys, as the Cuban so eloquently proved. After that first round, Dillon hadn't scored a single point that mattered, and the Cuban made him pay for those early hits. He wondered why it didn't hurt. Darkness whispered in his ears, but it gave him no answers. The lights in his mind dimmed, and the last thing he saw, or thought he saw, was a figure, a man, a woman, he couldn't tell, move toward the IV stand, a small plastic needle in one hand. The figure inserted the dagger point of the needle into a port on the IV. Dillon thought he saw some ruby red liquid, some exotic medicine flow from the needle into the IV. Then the darkness in his mind flared with red shadows, and he was gone again. When he woke up again, Dillon knew that he was actually awake. Not dead, not floating in limbo or purgatory or trying to run a shuck on St. Peter outside the gates. Alive. Balls. He knew from the way he felt that he'd been asleep for a long time. Easiest way to tell was by how much the painkillers had worn off. They don't keep giving you that shit unless you ask for it. Not in crap hospitals in Trenton. Not with his health plan. And every damn thing hurt. His face felt like it had been hand-carved from his skull, diced into little bits, run through a Cuisinart, and put back on, piece by piece, with staples. His teeth felt loose and his hair hurt. His body hurt too, but not as intensely. That pain was distant, like an echo. It took him a while to figure out how to move his hand, but finally his fingers twitched, like the thick legs of some obscene spider, and slowly crawled across the sheets. He fumbled for the button that would call the nurse, couldn't find it, and then froze as someone pressed the control into his hand. "It's the top button," said a voice. It took Dillon a few seconds to make sense of that. Then he remembered the voice that had called his name earlier. Was that today or last month or a year ago? Dylan decided to open an eye and look at whoever it was. One eyelid refused to budge. It felt like it weighed 20 pounds and was cemented shut. That was the one the Cuban kid had wailed on every single goddamn round. Fucker had a thing for that eye. The other one wasn't as badly puffed, but opening it was like jacking up a truck. He said, "Ow." It took a few seconds for his eye to focus. The hospital room was small and cheerless, with furniture that was purely functional and clearly intended to make people want to leave the hospital as soon as possible. There was a window that gave a wonderful view of a brick wall streaked with pigeon shit. There were no cards or flowers on the dresser. The TV was off. Dylan turned his head very, very carefully to look at the person sitting in the visitor's chair. He was a total stranger. Young white guy, 20-ish. Rail thin, but thin the way models and art dealers are. Like he enjoyed looking like a rake handle. Dark hair combed back, dark eyes, red lips that Dylan thought were painted with lipstick, but weren't. Expensive suit, expensive watch and rings. "Who the fuck are you?" croaked Dylan. The man gave him a bland, friendly smile that curled his lips without showing his teeth. "My name is Viktor Petrov." "Russian?" "Russian." Dylan tried to pry open the file cabinet in his brain. Did he owe anything to one of the Russian bookies? He didn't think so, but it wasn't impossible. The Russians had taken over the kind of mixed martial arts matches Dylan fought in. They'd crowded the Brazilians out a couple of years ago because they were more ruthless, but also more organized. And let's face it, Brazilian street thugs, no matter how tough they were, weren't going to get into any serious pissing contests with guys who were ex-Spetsnaz and ex-KGB. The Russians were ass-deep in muscle who were ex-Special Forces. Dylan said nothing. His tendency towards smart-ass remarks did not extend to deliberately pissing off the Russians. "Are you in very much pain?" asked Petrov. Dylan licked his lips. "It's not too bad. Can you move your legs?" The question scared Dylan, but when he tried to move his feet, they moved. Not well, but they moved. Petrov nodded. "Good." "Why? Did I hurt my back?" "You had a neck injury," said Petrov, "but it's nothing permanent. Some discomfort for a while." "Did they have to operate?" "No." I thought I saw... did you inject something into my IV?" Petrov took a while before he answered. "Yes." "Are you my doctor?" "I am part of the treatment team," said Petrov. "A consultant." "My head's all messed up," said Dylan cautiously. "So sorry if I'm a little slow here, but do I know you? Have we met somewhere?" Instead of answering, Petrov said, "I've seen you fight." "You mean you saw that Cuban kid kick my head in?" "Well, that too, but I've seen you fight in better days." Dylan laughed even though it hurt his chest to do it. "And you got a long memory, friends, 'cause my better days were so long ago dinosaurs were running the world." Petrov smiled at that. His face looked like a moray eel when he smiled. "It wasn't that long ago, Mr. Dylan. I can well remember when you were the up-and-coming thing. A real martial artist in a league that has become glutted with brawlers whose only talent is that they haven't evolved enough to feel pain. Mouth-breathing Neanderthals." "A Cuban kid had some moves," said Dylan. Petrov shrugged.
5 years ago you would have beaten him.
Dillon said nothing. He wanted to give a nonchalant shrug, but that would involve using too many brutalized muscles.
Kid had some moves. He had youth and the stamina that comes with it, said Petrov, dismissing the Cuban with a wave of his hand. 5 years ago he wouldn't have lasted 4 rounds with you. 10 years ago he would never have made it past round 1. Yeah, well, everyone gets old. One of these days some kid will be handing the Cuban kid his ass. Way of the world.
Petrov crossed his legs and arched an eyebrow.
Way of the world,
he echoed, taking his time, tasting each word.
Fighters aren't built to last,
said Dillon. Then he sighed.
But yeah, once upon a time I had the juice. I was always hard to hurt. Hardly ever bled, which keeps the refs from stopping the fight. And I could take a punch off of anyone. And you are trained as a true fighter, a warrior. Daito Ryu Aikido-jitsu, if I'm not mistaken. For how many years? Started when I was 6,
said Dillon, and for a moment he felt a flush of pride.
So, call it 35 years and change. Started cage fighting when I was 18. 23 long damn years ago. I know. 92 fights, 57 wins, 2 ties, 33 losses. You knocked out or choked out 43 of your opponents, and you were only carried off 4 times, counting last night. So, you know more about martial arts than most of the fighters in your league put together. Real martial arts. The deep knowledge, the genuine skills, the kind of knowledge that should be preserved but which is fading in obscurity with each new generation.
Dillon sighed.
Yeah, no shit. I opened a bunch of dojos over the years, traditional stuff, very old school. But no one wants to spend the time to learn the old stuff. They want a few flashy moves, a quick belt promotion, and then they want to call themselves masters. Breaks my heart. Mine too. I have very little appreciation for new things, Mr. Dillon. I'm very much an old-fashioned kind of person.
Dillon had to restrain himself from snorting. The Russian looked like he was 2 or 3 years out of high school.
It's a shame, continued Petrov, that you can't use those old-school skills in your matches. Ha! I wish. But the league don't let guys like me bring out A-game. Pity. Gotta have rules, I guess, said Dillon bitterly. You can't really unload on a guy even in a cage match. People get killed.
Petrov smiled, and he slowly traced the outline of his sensuous mouth with the sharp tip of one manicured fingernail.
That's not what they tell the rubs. The league's advertising goes to great lengths to declare that this is no holds barred, that everything is legal, that this is, what's the phrase they use all the time? Fighting as real as it gets.
He gave a derisive snort.
What do you expect?
Asked Dillon, unsure where this guy was going with this.
This is a sport. It ain't Spartacus and shit.
Petrov sighed.
Alas, no. Those were the good old days.
You're a fucking weirdo, thought Dillon, but he kept that to himself.
I bet you'd give a lot to fight the way you truly know how to fight, with subtlety, with ruthless efficiency, with a deadly grace. I wouldn't go that far, said Dillon. You don't need to kill people to have a good fight. There are a lot of old-school techniques that I could have used. Why didn't you?
Dillon shrugged. The action was painful, and Dillon winced.
Bad timing. If I knew what I know now back when I started in this league, it'd be a whole different thing. But even setting aside the lethal stuff, the moves that would neutralize a bull like that Cuban kid doesn't take insane amounts of strength, but it does require speed and control. Thing is, the more damaged your muscles get, the less precise your control is. That's where the problem comes in. The older you get, the more you know, but the older your body gets, the less able you are to use that knowledge. It's proof that the universe likes playing sick jokes. I supposed you would like to have your old speed and control back last night. No shit. But if wishes were horses, murmured Dillon sourly.
Petrov uncrossed his legs and leaned forward.
Suppose you could get your mojo back. Very funny, ha. I'm serious. Serious about what? About getting back in the ring for real. Wouldn't that be great? Wouldn't that be worth anything? To be at the top of your game. To be Killer Dillon once again. Killer Dillon? Christ. Nobody's called me that in years. That was from my old boxing days. Corny name. No, said Petrov quickly. It's not. It's a name filled with great promise. It's a name that used to give your opponent serious pause, and one that could strike genuine fear into anyone who steps into the cage with you.
Dillon laughed, even though it hurt his face to do it. He raised the hand with the IV drip and waggled it back and forth.
I'm 5 years past my expiration date, son. I should have quit after I lost a split decision with that Polish son of a bitch from Detroit. What was his name? Lenny the Breaker Sapolsky. That bastard fair beat the white off my ass. Should have realized he was trying to beat some sense into me, but I was too far into my own shit. Back then I still believed all the hype. I was still high off of my win-loss stats from 10 years back. And man, there's nothing sadder than a cage fighter who's losing every fight and still blaming it on a bad streak that's gonna end soon. It's not a streak, it's a downward slide, and it doesn't end. But by the time you realize that, you've lost your punch and your reflexes are shot from muscle fatigue, nerve damage, and too damn many miles on the odometer. And you're already into the phase of your life where you're nothing but a punching bag for younger, better fighters, and a punch line to the guys who knew you when.
Petrov was nodding while Dillon spoke.
Yes,
he said softly.
But I've seen how you fight. You always make the right choice. Kick or punch or takedown. You knew 10 times what the Cuban fighter knew. That was true of your fight with Breaker Sapolsky. You were the better fighter. I lost those fights, in damn near every fight over the last 5 years. You lost because your age and the amount of damage you've sustained over your career have slowed your body and made your reflexes betray you. Yeah, well, that's why they call this a young man's game. No, that's why this game has become polluted, Mr. Dillon, said Petrov sternly. When these matches first got started, there were some real fighters in there, men and women who knew the martial arts. Now what do you have? Thugs, barroom bouncers, brawlers, goons who don't understand the martial arts, not in any real sense. Men who don't care about the martial arts. This is just a game to them, and for many of them it's the only work they could get because they lack the raw intelligence even to work in construction. And they take themselves too seriously to go into professional wrestling. He sniffed. At least the professional wrestlers call it sports entertainment. They make no pretense about it being a genuine sport. These thugs have so crowded MMA competitions that they've become the standard for excellence. People look at them and think that these are the masters of unarmed combat. It's as close as you're ever going to get to having real masters climb into the cage," observed Dillon. "Most of them are too smart to risk getting wailed on. Most of them are too old. By the time they really qualify as masters, they're too old for full contact sports. Sure, they could kick 10 kinds of ass in a street encounter, but self-defense against a junkie with a knife or a couple of gangbangers is one thing. The techniques you'd use in those situations come from a whole different toolbox than the stuff we're allowed to use in cage matches. And just from the point of view of recovering from injuries, I bet that Cuban kid won't even show a bruise by Tuesday, and my face will look like a tropical sunset for 2 weeks. And I'll be walking like an 80-year-old man for at least that long." He shook his head. "Nah, this is a young man's game. The real masters either aren't interested in showing off in the ring or they can't see how the risk-reward thing tilts in their favor. Too much to lose. Not enough worth winning." He fumbled for the remote and hit the button for the nurse, but she still didn't come. "God damn it." "Not necessarily so," said Petrov. Dillon, distracted by the lack of a nurse showing up, had lost the thread of the conversation. "What?" "I said that while I agree with your assessment, there is more to the equation than that." Dillon squinted at him with his one good eye. "Like what?" "The only way a master, some guy who's spent 40, 50 years going all the way deep into a martial art, is going to last more than a round with a 20-something gorilla who can barely feel pain." Petrov said nothing. He folded his hands on his lap and gave Dillon a bland smile. "What?" asked Dillon. "You saying you know someone willing to take that kind of a risk?" No answer. "You're nuts," said Dillon. "Look, it's not even worth it from a purely financial perspective. Guy who spent his life training to become a master, a real, genuine master of a martial art, he's got a school, or maybe a chain of schools, filled with students who look to him as the icon of martial arts skill. Now understand, all of this belief is based on what they see in class and a kind of faith that their master could go all Jet Li on the bad guys in a real fight. But these kinds of guys don't get into real fights. Avoidance is a big part of their lifestyles. They're passive. They'll walk away from an insult rather than fighting over it. So their ability to deliver the absolute combat goods is never seen but deeply believed by everyone from the newest white belt to the most senior assistant instructor. Now, if one of these masters does something as dumb as climb into a cage to fight someone like Breaker Sapolsky or the Cuban kid, he risks losing. He knows he can't match the younger fighters for stamina, and he probably doesn't have anywhere near the same protective muscle mass, which means he's jousting without armor. He also knows that he can't use his best stuff. He can't dip into his black bag of tricks and do shit like rupture the spleen, smash the hyoid bone, shatter the knee, burst eardrums, pop an eyeball, or anything else that he might use in a real street defense. He's facing a fighter who spends all of his time preparing to be hit, and whose arsenal of those strikes and kicks allowed in the cage. It would be like taking a master-level swordsman from Renaissance Italy, giving him a fake sword, and then putting him in the ring with a Viking who has a sharpened war axe. It's an unfair contest on too many levels. The only way it could be fair, and this is pure fucking fantasy here, is if you could take all of the knowledge and experience from the old masters and somehow put it into the heads of the young Turks. Then, even though there would still be some restrictions on certain techniques, you see what master-level martial arts are like when it goes whole hog, but that's a pipe dream. "Ah," said Petrov, holding up a finger. "That is exactly my point. That's a tragedy right there.
Dylan frowned.
Huh? At no point in this sport that we both love so well are we seeing anything approximating the kind of fair fight you postulate. The game is skewed. The rules are fractured. This is why these matches draw the worst kind of gambler.
Petrov laughed.
You're right to feel a measure of disdain for the kind of brawlers who dominate the sport, but I have equal disdain for the breed of gambler attracted to these kinds of blood sports. They're the same low-brow crowd who bet on cockfights and dogfights. They bet on animals fighting animals.
Now it was Dylan's turn to remain silent. He was smart enough to recognize the insult buried inside that comment, but at the same time, he couldn't really take offense. He was a dumb hulk fighting in a league of dumb hulks. No better than chickens or pit bulls, except in being smart enough to know that this was no kind of life at all. Petrov adjusted his cuffs and necktie. He was dressed very well, expensive clothes, but good taste expensive rather than fuck-up expensive. Attention to quality rather than for display. Russian mafia guys often dressed nice. You never saw them in those damn tracksuits the Jersey Goombas wore. None of the open-shirted satin finish sport coats of the Cuban players. This guy could be selling expensive watches or showing you $4 million homes with a view. When it was clear that Petrov wasn't going to say anything either, Dylan cleared his throat and said,
So where does that leave us other than lamenting what I don't have? I ask because I hurt too much to lay here singing the blues.
Petrov nodded, as if that was the right thing to have said.
I was at your first fight,
he said.
You saw that?
Dylan narrowed his eyes.
Where, on tape?
No.
I was at the Princeton Stadium when you fought 2 matches on the same card. Leroy the Lion King Sanders and then Sunny Day. Bet you don't remember much. That was 23 years ago. You were what, an embryo?
A lot older than that, said Petrov with a chuckle.
And I remember both fights as if they happened this morning. The so-called Lion King went down in the very first round. He threw 2 punches and then tried to sweep your leg. You kick-checked his sweep, that I bet no one past the first row saw, and then you hit him with a back wrist strike to the floating ribs that sent a shockwave through his abdomen which caused his diaphragm to spasm. Very, very subtle. The judges scored it as a back fist because they were too dense to know what they were looking at. And your finishing blows? 1 2-knuckle tap to the left sinus that had to fill his eyes with tears and cause enough shock to the eustachian tubes to make him gag. Then you hit him with a tight looping palm that only 4 martial arts styles teach. It hit the precise point on his jaw that snapped his head around far too fast for his body to follow, which created a corkscrew twist of the brain stem. He was out before he began to fall.
Dylan narrowed his eyes.
Who told you all that?
The blow-by-blow in the fight magazines called that last combination a jab-hook-punch combo.
The trade magazines are staffed by hacks who don't know a hammer blow from a blow job.
Fair enough. But that doesn't explain how you know what I did.
I told you, Mr. Dylan. I was there.
Not a chance in hell. Even if you're older than you look, you couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 years old. Only an advanced pro would have recognized what I was doing. Petrov shrugged.
The second match lasted 2 rounds,
he said. Sunny Day was a better fighter. It was only 'cause someone else dropped that I wound up on the card with him. Nobody expected Lion King to go more than a round.
Sunny Day was the full-contact fighting champion of the Deep South. 44 wins, 1 loss, and that was a split decision.
Like I said,
I remember watching that fight.
Petrov reminded him.
They only tagged you twice, both with jabs while you were feeling each other out. After that, he never scored 1 single point that mattered. By the end of the 2nd round, he was out on his feet. You delivered a series of blows to acupressure points that systematically shut down his ability to defend himself. You could have taken him down halfway through that round and choked him out. He had nothing left.
He might have hurt bad, if I tried. Get a guy who's that dazed, he might not have enough marbles left to tap out. Better to dance him a little and let the corner man and the ref stop the fight.
Which they did.
Sure. Petrov leaned his elbows on his thin knees.
You were a superior fighter, Mr. Dillon. If you'd have been able to get into the better leagues and better venues while you were still young enough, you could have been a contender. You might have been the champion.
A lot of good guys up on that level.
Few of whom are as good as you. Few of whom know as much about real martial arts. Few of whom care about real martial arts. There are people who still bet on you, despite your recent stats, because they know that you have more knowledge, more real skill than the apes who dominate the league. I've made several such bets. If you were to win one of these fights, the return on the bet would be considerable.
Then you got money to burn, 'cause even I don't bet on myself anymore. See these knuckles, the way they're too large? That's arthritis. I got osteo from old damage, and now I'm getting rheumatoid. You want to bet on me in a cage match against old age? Dillon pushed the button for the nurse, who still didn't come.
The fuck?
Growled Dillon. The pain was getting worse, his whole body like it was about to catch fire. Petrov reached out and closed his hand gently around Dillon's wrist. Dillon immediately flinched back from the man's touch. The Russian's skin was as cold as ice and clammy as a locker room wall.
Don't worry about the nurse,
he said. Dillon tried to pull his hand away, but the Russian's grip was bizarrely strong. That was weird, because even beat up and half dead in a hospital, Dillon outweighed Petrov by 90 pounds, and none of those pounds were fat. At 41, Dillon was rock solid. Maybe past his own prime, but stronger than this pencil neck. Except that he wasn't. Petrov's hand was like an icy cuff locked around Dillon's wrist.
Please, Mr. Dillon,
said the Russian in a soft voice.
Please. We're having a nice and very productive talk. Let's continue to have that talk.
Let go of me, you freak. After a long moment, Petrov opened his fingers. Dillon snatched his arm away and immediately began massaging his skin, which was cold and sore. What the fuck, man? He growled.
I'm sorry for the discomfort,
said Petrov. Shit! You almost broke my goddamn arm.
I'm sorry, but...
What the hell? You're a friggin' stick figure. What are you taking? Steroids? Meth? Petrov's smile turned sly.
Ah,
what? Is it meth?
No.
Then what? You're on something. A skinny young prick like you shouldn't be that strong. What are you on?
What I'm on, to use your word, is part of why I'm here. And before we get to that, I want to correct a small mistake.
What? Asked Dillon uncertainly. If he wasn't so thoroughly flattened by injury and painkillers, he would have bolted for the door. He cut quick looks at the door anyway, wondering if he could make it to the nurse's station.
How old do you think I am?
Asked Petrov, and the question was so weird and unrelated to anything that was happening that it jolted Dillon and made him whip his head around. What?
You keep saying I'm young, and I admit that I look young, but how old do you actually think I am? Who gives I ask? Because the reason I'm so strong and the reason I look so young are both side effects of what I'm on.
Dylan had no idea where this was going, so he said nothing. Petrov fished in his wallet and produced his driver's license.
I am 57 years old, said Petrov, and before you ask, I have never had a facelift or any Botox injections.
Dylan stared at the license and then at Petrov.
Bullshit.
Petrov put the wallet away.
That's bullshit,
insisted Dylan. Petrov spread his hands.
Listen to me, Mr. Dylan, and give me an honest answer. What if there was a way for you to get back your youth, your strength, your speed? What if that process also repaired any damage, no matter how old, and which also helped you heal at an accelerated rate from any new damage?
You're definitely on something. Magic mushrooms is something.
Petrov ignored that. What if you go back into the ring with all of the knowledge you currently possess, but with your body and reflexes at the very peak of conditioning? Stronger, faster, more durable, less vulnerable. Can you lie there and tell me that you wouldn't want to climb into the ring again without age and scar tissue and disease hanging around your neck like a ton of bricks?
That's a stupid question, snapped Dylan. Of course I would. Who wouldn't? But the league dope tests us all the time. I come up positive for steroids or something, I'd be out on my ass, stripped of all my titles, barred from even stepping foot in.
This isn't a steroid.
Or coke or some designer meth they test for everything.
They don't test for this,
said Petrov.
Or rather, they can't test for this. I can show you if you're genuinely interested.
Dylan studied him. The things the guy was saying were whacked out, but his tone and body language was calm. There were no crazy lights in his eyes. It was Petrov's calm rather than his words that kept Dylan's own emotions in check. And, well, Dylan was curious. Really curious. He was too old not to want to know. He was too badly hurt, too sore and spent not to want to know. And the warrior in his soul, the one that time and damage and arthritis was turning into an impotent old joke, wanted to know. Dylan licked his dry lips. Okay, he said. Show me. Petrov nodded and reached into the inner pocket of his suit. He produced 3 hypodermics. One was filled with a dark red liquid. The other 2 were empty.
I anticipated your interest,
he said softly.
I've already begun the treatment.
What? Croaked Dylan. What the fuck?
Shh,
soothed Petrov.
Just listen. There are 3 steps to the process, all very antiseptic, all done with the greatest of care.
He held up one of the empty syringes so Dylan could see that there were trace amounts of red liquid in it.
For step 1, I drew a few cc's of your blood.
Who gave you permission, you son of a...
Please, Mr. Dylan, we both know that we are not talking about an approved medical procedure. It was totally safe, so you have nothing to worry about, and it's already done. So please, bear with me.
Dylan lapsed into a tense and angry silence. However, fear gnawed at him. What had this maniac done to him? Petrov said,
I injected your blood into my arm.
Dylan's mouth hung open in shock.
Then, after a wait of a few hours, I drew off 2 syringes of my blood, I injected one syringe into you via the port on your IV. I believe you were semi-conscious at the time. Do you remember?"
Dillon did remember, and his fear began growing into terror. Petrov showed him the third syringe, the one that was still filled with red liquid. With blood.
God,
thought Dillon.
Why, for Christ's sake?
Petrov's smile faded.
Because, Mr. Dillon, the injury you sustained in last night's fight was far more serious than you know. The Cuban hit you with a powerful blow at an unfortunate angle. It cracked 2 cervical vertebrae, and the broken bones caused a deep laceration to your spinal cord. The doctors are discussing their options, but so far it is their belief that you will be a quadriplegic. Everything from the neck down died last night, Mr. Dillon. You were destroyed in the ring.
Dillon thrashed backward from Petrov's words, his feet kicking at the sheets, fingers stabbing the device to call the nurse.
"Fuck you!"
he roared.
"Fuck you! I'm not crippled, you stupid bastard! Look, I'll kick your ass!"
Petrov sat where he was, the syringe held between 2 slender fingers. He waited for Dillon's tirade to wind down. Dillon flopped back, gasping.
"I'm not crippled,"
he snarled.
Of course not,
agreed Petrov.
But you were?
Dillon opened his mouth, but nothing came out.
Before I injected my blood into you, you were dead from the collarbones down. Machines breathed for you. Machines pumped your heart.
Dillon raised his hands and looked at them, totally perplexed.
But it's not a drug,
said Petrov.
It's blood. There is a very, very old biblical saying, blood is the life. That is so very true.
What are you talking about? Petrov waggled the full syringe between his fingers.
The process is simple. I consume your blood, you consume mine. Writers have mythologized the process in all sorts of absurd ways, but in simple terms, it's an exchange of certain key biological materials. A virus, a very ancient virus, activates dormant DNA in you, and that begins a process whereby certain biological and genetic changes take place. The initial stages of the process occur very quickly. The complete transformation, however, takes years.
Virus.
Oh, don't get hung up on that part, Mr. Dillon. This will be the very last virus that will ever affect you. After this, no more colds, no more flu, no cancer, no arthritis, not even the heartbreak of psoriasis.
You're insane.
Not at all.
Petrov got to his feet and came to stand close to Dillon. He plugged the syringe into the port, but did not depress the plunger.
If I do nothing, the effect of the first injection will eventually wear off, and you'll be exactly where you were last night, a head attached to a lump of dead meat. The first injection is self-reversing, so if you want me to walk away, then I'll go.
Dillon said nothing. He could not compose a single sentence, not even a single word that made sense.
However, if you give me permission, then I will inject the second dose of my blood, and within 48 hours you will walk out of this hospital. You'll probably feel so good you'll want to run. Within 72 hours, you won't be able to find a single trace of any of the injuries you sustained in that fight. Within a week, no X-ray, MRI, or CT scan will be able to find a trace of arthritis or scar tissue. Who are you?
breathed Dillon.
What are you?
Petrov smiled, but unlike his earlier smiles, this one was a broad grin that showed lots of white teeth. Lots of sharp, white teeth.
I think you know what I am,
said Petrov. Dillon wanted to scream. He tried to shrink away, but his body was sluggish, as if the numbness he'd felt last night was creeping back. The sight of those terrible teeth filled his mind with horror show images of pale creatures rising from graves and tearing the throats out of the innocent. He wanted to shout a word, to put the label on the monster that stood above him, but he could not force himself to say that word. It was an impossible thing. To say it might make it real.
Why are you doing this to me?
He hissed. Petrov blinked as if surprised.
Why am I saving your life? Why am I giving you eternal youth and strength and health? I thought we already covered that. Because of the fights? I already told you that I was very old school, Mr. Dillon. I, and those like me, appreciate only the finest things. Immortality tends to cultivate more sophisticated tastes, as I hope you'll discover. I've always been a fight fan, even before I became what I am. I want to stop being a spectator and get involved more deeply in the sport, as a manager, as a promoter, but I don't want to trot out one mouth-breathing tug after another. Just as this process will elevate you to a high level, I want to elevate the sport of full-contact fighting to a level it has never before been able to reach, a class of masters. Are there others like you? Not yet. I want you to be the first. I want you to cut a swath through the brawlers currently in the game, and then make room for a new breed of martial arts competitor. Immortal masters. Come now, Mr. Dillon. Tell me you wouldn't give everything to see fights where both competitors could use their greatest skills to showcase the elegant beauty and sophisticated science of the real martial arts. Tell me that doesn't stir your soul.
Dillon stared at him but said nothing. His arms and legs began to tingle again. His fingers were already going numb. Petrov caressed the plunger of the hypodermic with one pale thumb. Tears broke from the corners of Dillon's eyes.
I don't want to be a monster,
he said softly.
We are not monsters,
said Petrov with surprising gentleness.
We are elevated beings. Call it the next step in evolution. Call it whatever you want. We don't fear the cross. We don't hunt the innocent. None of that. So tell me, Mr. Dillon, Master Dillon, what's your choice? Ordinary or extraordinary? A broken man dying in a forgotten hospital ward, or the champion you were born to be?
Dillon could not feel his hands and feet.
Do it,
he whispered. The end. The Death Song of Dwar Guntha. Barsoom is a highly martial place. Visitors would be well advised to get their hands on a sword and learn how to use it, not only because the environment is generally violent and lawless, but also because virtually all Barsoomian societies assign status based on battle prowess. In fact, among the green men, you haven't even earned the right to a last name until you've slain a local chieftain. Visitors to Barsoom are faced with a dizzying array of unfamiliar ranks and titles, the highest of which are the Jedaks, emperors, and Jeds, kings. You can also expect to see plenty of military officers, Jedwars, warlords, Oddwars, generals, Dwars, captains, and Padwars, lieutenants. The stories of Edgar Rice Burroughs mainly focus on Jedaks, such as John Carter and Tars Tarkas, or princesses, such as Deja Thoris and Tara. But of course we can't forget that characters of a more humble station have adventures that are just as memorable as our next tale amply demonstrates. This story shows us a distant future in which John Carter is poised to finally bring an end to the endless cycles of warfare that have rocked Barsoom. Don't worry, though. Peace hasn't come quite yet, and there's more than enough action here to satisfy even the most hardened Barsoomian warrior. 1.
My name is Jex Toron, last Padwar of the Free Riders, and personal aide to Dwar Gunther. When he dies, however he dies, I pray I will go with him into the realm of legends, and that our song will be sung in Helium for 1,000 years. That is not a heroic boast. I won't fall upon my sword at the death of my captain, but I have been in 100 battles with him, and we have grown old together, and war is not an old man's game. For Oddwars and Jedwars, perhaps, but not for fighting men. Dwar Gunther? Ah, now there is a fighting man. Was he not with John Carter when the warlord raided the fortress of Issus? Aye, he was there, leading the mutiny of loyal Heliumites against the madness of Zat Aras. He was a man-at-arms in the palace when Carter was named Jedak of Jedaks, warlord of all Barsoom. And in the years that followed, how many times did Gunther ride out at the head of the warlord's riders? Look closely at Dwar Gunther's face and chest, and in the countless overlapping scars you'll see a map of history, a full account of the wars and battles, rescues and skirmishes. Now, though, John Carter himself is old. His children and grandchildren of his grandchildren are old. We red men of Helium are long-lived, but that old witch time, as they say, catches up to everyone. Gunther's right arm is not what it was, and I admit that I am slower on the draw, less sure on the cut, and less dexterous in the riposte than I once was. Even the heroes' songs for which I and my family have been famous these many generations have become echoes of old tales retold. In these days of peace, there are few opportunities for songmakers to tell of great and heroic deeds, just as there are few opportunities for warriors to pass into song in a moment of glorious battle. It seems to me, and to Gunther, that we live in an age of city men. City men, or perhaps civilized men, seek deaths in bed, just as our great-grandfathers once sought that long, last journey down the river Is. We spoke of such things, did Dwar Gunther and I, as we sat before a fire warming our hands on the blaze and our stomachs with red wine. The moons chased each other through the heavens, leaving in their wakes a billion swirling stars. Tomorrow might be our last day, and so many days lay behind us. It sat heavily upon Dwar Gunther that our last great song may already have been sung. I caught him looking into the flames with a distance at odds with the hawk-sharpness he usually displayed. "What is it?" I asked, and he was a long time answering. Instead of speaking, he straightened, set aside his cup, and drew his sword from its sheath of cured banth hide. Gunther regarded the blade for a moment, turning it this way and that, studying the play of reflected firelight on the oiled steel. Then, with a sigh, he handed it to me. "Look at it, Jex," he said heavily. "This is my third sword. When I was a lad and wearing a fighting man's rig for the first time, I carried my father's sword, a clunky chopper of Panarian make. My father was a palace guard, you know. Served 50 years, and never drew his weapon in anger. First time I used the sword in a real battle, I notched the blade on a Tharkian collar. Second time I used it, the blade snapped. When Zat Arras fitted out the fleet to pursue John Carter after he'd returned from Validor, Kantos Khan himself gave him a better sword. Good man, that. He was everything Zat Arras was not. And the sword he gave was a helium blade, light and strong and already blooded. It had belonged to a Padua friend of his who died nobly but had no heirs. I used that blade for over 20 years, Jex. It tasted the blood of green men and black men, of plant men and white apes, and it drank the blood of red men too. He sighed and reached for his cup. But I lost it when my scouting party was taken prisoner in that skirmish down south. No, why do I tell you, Jex? That's where we met, wasn't it? In the slave pits of Ankar-Dul. Remember how we broke out, clawing stones from the floor of our cell and tunneling inch by inch under the wall, running naked into the forests, wasted by starvation, filthy and unarmed. I smiled and nodded. We were armed when we returned. Gunther smiled too and nodded at the blade. That was the first time I used that sword. I took it from the ice pirate who sold us into slavery. I snuck into his tent and strangled him with a lute string, and for a time I thought I would throw this sword away as soon as its immediate work was done. That would have been a shame, I said as I hefted the sword, letting the weight of the blade guide the turn and fall and recovery of my fist on my wrist. The balance was superb, and the blade flashed fire as it cut circles in the air. And so it would, he agreed, and his smile faded away by slow degrees. Yet look at it, Jex. See the nicks and notches that have cut so deep that no smith can sharpen them out. And along the blood gutter, see the pits? Shake it, you can feel the softness of the tang, and if you listen close, you can hear it cry out in weary protest. I heard it crack yesterday when we fell upon the garrison that was fleeing this fort. Hearing it crack was like hearing my own heart break. I lowered the sword and looked at him. Firelight danced in his eyes, but otherwise his face might have been the death mask of some ancient hero. I know of 50 songs in which your sword is named, Gunther, said I, and twice a dozen names it has been given. Horok the Breaker, Lightning Sword of the East, Pirate's Bane, and Thark's Friend. Those songs will still be sung when the moons are dust. Perhaps. They are old songs, written when each morning brought the clash of steel upon steel. What do we hear each morning now? Bird song, he grunted in disgust. Call me superstitious, Jex, or call me an old fool, but I believe that my sword has sung its last songs. There is still tomorrow. The pirates will come and try to take this fort back from us. No, he said. They will take it back, and they will slaughter us to a man and bury our bodies in some forgotten valley. No one will see us die, and no one will write our last song. A death in battle is a death in battle, I observed, but he shook his head. You quote your own songs, Jex, he said. And when you wrote it, you were quoting me. Ah, I said, remembering. Tomorrow is death, said Gunther, but not a warrior's death. We will try and hold the walls, and they will wear us down and root us out like lice. Extermination is not a way for a warrior to end his own song. There are too few of us to make a stand, and all of us are old. Where once we were the elite, the right hand of John Carter, now we are a company of dotards. An inconvenience to a dishonorable enemy. No, I began, but he cut me off with a shake of the head. We've known each other too long and too well for us to tell lies in the dark. The sun has set on more than this fortress, Jex, and I am content with that. He paused. Well, almost content. I am not a hero. I'm a simple fighting man, and perhaps I should show more humility. I have been given 1,000 battles. It is gluttony to crave one more. Again I made to speak, and again he shook his head. Let me ramble, Jex. Let me draw this poison out of my spirit. He sipped wine, and I refilled both of our cups. I have always been a fighting man. Always. I could never have done temple duty like my father, standing in all that finery during endless ceremonies while my sword rusted in its sheath for want of a good blooding. No, that was never for me. Perhaps I am less civilized than my father. Perhaps I belong to an older age of the world when warriors lived life to its fullest and died before they got old. You've fought in more battles than anyone I've ever heard of, I said. Perhaps more than the great Tars Tarkas or the warlord himself. You've been in most of their battles, and 100 besides. And what is the result, Jex? The world has grown quiet. There are no new songs. The warlord has tamed Barsoom. He's broken the Assassin's Guild and exposed the corruption of the nobles in the courts of Helium, made allies of the Tharks and Ocarians, overthrew the Chaldaeans, driven out most of the pirates except these last desert scum, and brought peace to the warring kingdoms. And you were there for much of that, Gunther. This very sword sang its song in the greatest battles of all time. Ah, friend Jex, you miss my point, he said. He sipped his wine and shook his head. It is because of all those battles. It is because of all the good that has been done with sword and gun and airship that I sit here, old and disgruntled and, yes, drunk. It is because of the quiet of peace that I feel so cheated.
Cheated?
By myself. By our success. I never wanted to die the way my father did. An old man drooling down my chest while his great-great-grandchild swaddled him in diapers. Nor would I want to live on in retirement, he said, wincing at the word. While my sword hangs above a hearth, a relic whose use is forgotten and whose voice is stilled.
We sat there, both of us staring into the fire. I took a breath and held out his sword. He looked at it the way a man might regard a friend who has betrayed him.
Better I should break it over a rock than let it fail in a pointless battle.
Take it, Gunther, I said softly. I believe it still has one song left to sing. His hand was reluctant, but finally he did take it back and slid it with a soft rasp into its sheath.
What song is left to old men, Jex?
Tomorrow. He shook his head.
You weren't listening. Tomorrow is a slaughter and nothing more. We will rise and put on our weapons and gear, and then we will die. No one will write that song. No victory will be won. It will be a minor defeat in a war that will pass us by. We are small and peripheral to it, as old men are often peripheral things. No, Jex. Though we may wet our blades in the dawn's red glow, there is nothing.
His voice trailed off and stopped. Gunther drew a breath and straightened his back, staring down in his cup for long moments as logs crackled and hissed in the fire.
Gods,
he said softly,
listen to me. I'm an old woman. The wine has had the better of me. Forget I spoke.
Do you say so? I asked, cocking my head at him. He forced a smile onto his seamed face.
Surely you can't take my ramblings seriously, old friend, nor hold them against me after we've drained our cups how many times? Who am I, after all? Not an odd war or a jedak. A dwar I am, and a dwar I shall die, though.
He paused and looked around at the men who slept under rough blankets on the wooden walkway behind the parapets of the small stone fort.
Truly, for a warrior what greater honor is there than to have been the captain of men such as these? Surely none of my songs would have ever been sung had it not been for the company of such as they.
One might say so of all heroes, Gunther, I pointed out. I took the wineskin and filled our cups.
Not so. John Carter needs no company of men to help him. Even old, he is stronger than the strongest.
He is not of this world, I reminded him. Besides, how many times has he been captured during his adventures? How many times has his salvation relied on others, on warriors, even on women and men from other races? The great Tarkus has saved his life 12 times.
Just as John Carter saved his,
Gunther fired back, which only makes my point. What man is a hero without another warrior or ally at his back?
Like you and me,
conceded Gunther, then gave another nod to the sleeping soldiers.
And these creaky old rogues.
Just so. And it is because men need other men in order to live long enough to become heroes that I am able to write songs. Otherwise no one would be alive to tell me the tales that become my songs.
And I thought your lot made it all up,
Gunther said, though I knew he was joking. We embellish, to be sure, I said unabashedly. All heroes are handsome, all princesses beautiful, all dangers fell, all escapes narrow, and all victories legendary. You, for example, are taller, slimmer, and better looking in my songs. We laughed and toasted that.
But see here,
Gunther said, warming to the discourse.
Surely there is another kind of hero in songs, the hero whose tale is sung over his grave.
Ah, you speak of the tragic hero who dies at the moment of his fame. Is it a death song you crave now, Gunther? Since when do you like sad songs?
Not all death songs are sad. Some are glorious, and many are rallying cries.
They are all sad, I said. Gunther shook his head.
Not to the fallen. Such songs are not melancholy, Jex. Such songs are perhaps the truest hero's tale, for they capture the warrior at the peak of his glory, with no postscript to tell of the dreary and ordinary days that followed. There are many who would agree that a hero should never outlive his own song. I know I would have no regrets.
I would have one, I said.
Eh?
If you were to die in such a glorious battle, you know that I would be by your side. Our men, too. We would all go down together, our blood filling the inkwells of the song-makers.
So what is your regret?
I smiled. I am just arrogant enough to want to outlive our deaths so that I would be the one to write that song. Gunther laughed long and loud. Some of the sleeping men muttered and pulled their blankets over their heads.
By Jex, you'll have to teach your ghost the art of crafting songs.
We laughed, but less so this time, and then we lapsed into a long silence. Gunther and I looked out beyond the battlements of our stolen outpost, past the glow of torches, into the velvety blackness of the night. The moons were down now, and starlight was painted on the silks of 10,000 banners and 100,000 tents. Cook fires glowed like a mirror of the constellations above. Gunther went and leaned on the wall, and I with him, and we stared at the last army of the pirates of Barsoom. 300,000 foot soldiers and a cavalry of 5,000 mounted knights. Resting now, waiting for dawn. It was a nice joke to call them pirate scum and a rabble army, but the truth was there before us. It was one of the greatest armies ever assembled, and it marched on Helium and the lands of the warlord. Would our lands go down in flames? We told ourselves no. We had learned long ago to believe that John Carter, Jeddak of Jeddaks, would find a way to rally and respond and soak the dead soil of Barsoom in the blood of even so vast an army. I knew that this was the core of Gunther's despair. He wanted to be there. He wanted to be with the warlord when the true battle came. Even though he believed that his next battle would be his last, he wanted that battle to matter, to mean something, to be legendary. We were a nuisance who took this fortress by luck and audacity, but, as Gunther said, we would be swatted before the sun was above the horizon. We would not see the warlord's fleet of airships fill the skies from horizon to horizon. We would not be there when the last, truly the last, great battle of our age was fought. We would already be dead, forgotten,
buried in the rubble of a fort that still stood only because it was inconvenient to take it from us in the dark. There would be no moment to shine, no glory, no notice. There would only be death, and then a slide into nothingness as memories of us were overlaid by the songs that would be written about the real battle. "Perhaps the warlord will come with the dawn," I said. "The messengers we sent were well mounted." He gave another weary shake.
"No. They would need to fly on wings to have reached even the most distant outposts. Had we an airship, but no. John Carter will come, and he will come in all his might and wrath, but our song, my friend, will have ended long before."
"You would never have made a song-maker," I said. "You don't know how to write an ending to your own tale."
"Ha!"
He laughed.
"That is what I've been trying to tell you all evening."
2. Gunther woke me at the blackest hour of night. Only cold starlight washed down upon him as he crouched over me. For my part, I came awake from a dream of battle. "What is it?" I cried. "Are we beset?" My sword was half drawn from its sheath when he caught my wrist.
"No, sheathe your sword, my friend,"
said he.
"Just listen to me for a moment, and then I'll let you rest."
"Speak, then," I said quietly, mindful of the men who slept around us.
"What I said earlier, they were weak words from an old tongue, and I ask that you forgive them."
"There is nothing to forgive."
"Forget them, then. I spoke from old age and regret, but as I lay upon my blanket I thought better of my words, and of my life. To blazes with death songs and glory, and to is with the ego of someone to whom the gods have granted 1,000 graces. I said that I was a dwarf, and by heaven I will die as one. Not as a hero in some grand song, but a simple man, doing a simple job for which he is well suited. A loyal soldier for whom his daily service to his lord is both his purpose and his reward."
He took a breath.
"I have had my day, and there need be no more songs for me. None to write and none to sing. Not for me, Jex, and not for us. The song is over. All that remains is to do one last day's honest work, and then I shall lay me down with a will, content that I have not betrayed the trust placed upon me."
I was tempted in my weariness to make light of so bold a speech at such an unlikely hour, but the starlight glittered in his eyes like splinters of sword steel, and all the shadows re-sculpted his face so that as he turned this way and that he was two different men, or perhaps two different versions of Dwar Gunther. When he turned to the right, it seemed to me that I looked upon a much younger man, the young dwarf I met in the dungeons so many years ago, and when he turned to the other side, the blue-white starlight painted his face into a mask like unto a funeral mask of some ancient king. Neither aspect betrayed even a whisper of the doubt or weakness that had been in his voice scant hours before. I sat up and put my hand on his shoulder. "Dwar Gunther," I said, "you would have made quite a singer of songs." He chuckled.
"Don't mock me. It's just that I had second thoughts after I lay down."
"Tell me."
"If we are to die tomorrow, or today, as I perceive that dawn is not many hours away, then at least let us satisfy ourselves to usefulness."
"I don't follow."
What would you rather do, Jex? Be an insect, to be smoked out of the cracks in these ancient walls and ground underfoot, or die as a fighting man?
You ask a question to which we both know the answer. The latter, always.
Then when the sun ignites the morning, let us not wait for death behind these walls. Let us ride out instead.
I smiled. Ride out?
Aye, a charge. We might make the upland cleft where the slopes narrow before they spill out onto the great plains. It's a bottleneck, and we could fill it. With our throats we could make a wall of spears.
Gunther slapped his thigh.
By the gods, I would bear death's ungentle touch, but I will not, cannot, bear it without blood upon my steel. Even if my blade breaks on iron circlet or skull beneath, then let it break thus, red to the hilt.
Ride out, I asked again. 16 against 100,000.
Better than 16 quivering behind battlements they don't have the numbers to defend.
We wouldn't last a minute.
And what a minute it would be.
No songs, I said.
No songs,
he agreed.
The only song that need be written today is that of John Carter, Jeddak of Jeddaks, as he fills the sky with ships and rains fury down upon this pirate scum. This is it, you know. This is the last battle. Even if we survived tomorrow, and there is scant chance of that, war is over for our generation. Once this army is crushed, then there will be peace on Barsoom. Peace! And it was our swords, Jex, that helped to bring about such a glorious and blessed and thoroughly depressing turn of events. No! Let us ride out to our doom and the dooms of those who first oppose us, the free riders of Helium sailing to paradise on a river of pirate blood.
I laughed. A singer of songs, indeed! We smiled at each other then. Dawn was coming, and we both knew that only one last sleep awaited us now. I'll go wake the others, said I. I think they will be pleased. And so they were. 3. Dawn did indeed come early, and with it the silver voices of 1,000 trumpets. My head ached with the hot hammers of the wine devils, but I was in my battle harness before the pale sunlight clawed its way over the horizon. Before the first echo of the trumpets had yet had time to reach the distant mountains and come back to us, we swung open the gates to the outpost, and the free riders rode out into the dawn. Such a sight it must have been, could I have but seen it from a lofty perch. 16 men, in heavy armour from another age, spears and lances, war hammers and swords, polished and glittering. The pirates scrambled to meet us, the pikemen and foot soldiers grabbing up pieces of armour even as they counted our numbers and laughed. Had I had any thought of surviving the day, I, too, might have laughed, but I knew a great secret that they did not. We were sufficient to our purpose. Plenty enough men to die. We raced to the upland cleft, which was a natural fissure in the red rock through which only 6 horses could pass at once. The footing was bad, and you needed a trail-wise thoat to navigate it at the best of times. All other passes were much stepped or littered with boulders which forced the army to funnel into the pass. Hence the reason they had not stopped for the night. We did not flatter ourselves that great monster of an army had paused for us.
Dwar Gunther rode before the company, his ancient sword held high. A dwarf from the pirates cupped hands around his mouth and bade Dwar Gunther to surrender. "Surrender, old man! Beg for your life and my Jeddak my spirit!" he taunted. Gunther never stopped smiling, even as he hefted his spear and threw it with great power and accuracy into the throat of the pirate dwarf.
"There is our surrender!"
Dwar Gunther cried aloud.
"We will write our names in the book of death with pirate blood. Have at you, bastards, and may the desert demons feast upon your cowardly bones!"
The pirates stared at the body of their fallen captain for a long moment, and then, with a great roar like a storming sea, they swept toward us. We formed ranks and drew into the cleft, and only when the first wave of them rushed up the hill at us, we charged out to meet them. Spears flashed like summer thunder, and the air was filled with a treasure house of bright red rubies. Ah, the killing! Gunther and I fought side by side, our throats rearing and slashing with steel-shod feet. The enemy was so determined to run us down that they sent lancers and foot soldiers in rather than archers. After all, who were we but a few old men on old horses? It was an arrogance that cost them dearly. And yes, it would have made a glorious song, a battle song, a death song that would be remembered long after our bones were dust. Alas! Each of the riders was a veteran of countless battles, old maybe, but deft and clever and ruthless. They laughed as they fought, delighting in the expressions of shock on the faces of much younger men who learned too little and too late that wisdom and experience often trumps youth and vigor. They came at us in that narrow defile, and we took them, shouting our ancient songs of war as the blood ran like a brook around our ankles. But there were 100,000 of them. Though they sent not a single man who could stand before the least of us, they had men to spare, and no sword arm can fight without fatigue forever. I saw Kinto Kan fall, his body feathered with arrows, but his own quiver empty, and the dead heaped around him, 26 to be his slaves in death. Ben Bendark, known as Stark Killer before the warlord forged the alliance, swung his war-axe, that great cleaver of 100 tavern songs, and the head of a pirate Jed flew from his shoulders. I never saw where it landed. Bendark gave a wild cry of red triumph even as spears pierced his chest and stilled his mighty heart. He fell next to his brother Gan, who smiled even in death, his mighty hands clenched forever around the shattered throats of the men who killed him. Hadro Henkin, the sword-dancer from Gathol, leaped and turned and cut men from the saddle and slipped between spears and left a path of ruin behind him. He made it nearly to the chariot of the Jeddak himself before a dozen spearmen converged and brought him down. His best friend, Zeth Hondat, screamed like a banth and threw himself at the spearmen, cutting them down 1, 2, 3, 4. 7 fell before the Jeddak raised a huge curved sword and cut Zeth nearly in twain. These things I saw, and more. The waves of pirates were as limitless as the dunes of a desert, an ocean of spears and swords, but Dwar Gunther had chosen our spot well, and we held the high ground while they were forced into a narrow killing chute. We slaughtered 5 times our number, 10 times, more, and still they came. As I parried and thrust, cut and slashed, I could not help but compose our song in my head. Despite the melancholy musings of last night, this was a glorious end. This was such an end that perhaps the pirates themselves would write the song. Not a hero's lament or a stirring death song, but a tale of desert demons who it took an army to overthrow. We would be the monsters to frighten children on dark nights, and that would please Dwarguntha. It was a way to strike once more into the heart of our enemy. In a moment's brief reprieve I called to him. Gunther bled from a dozen cuts and leaned heavily on his saddle-horn. "What a song!" I cried. "Sing it with your blade!" He laughed, and they were on us again. Then I saw three things occur in close succession, and what a wonder they were to behold. First I saw the fresh wave of pirates swarm toward us. They were burly men, not the foot soldiers or light skirmishers. These were the cream of their cavalry on fresh thoats, led by the fierce Jeddak in his war chariot. Dwarguntha reared up on his thoat, the reins flying free, a spear in one hand and his ancient sword in the other. With a cry so fierce and powerful that it momentarily stilled the war shouts of the pirates, Gunther thrust the spear deep into the roaring mouth of the chariot's lead thoat, and as the beast fell, the chariot tilted forward to offer the Jeddak up to Gunther's sword. The blade caught red sunlight and then flashed down, cleaving gold circlet and black skull, even as the Jeddak thrust his own great blade forward into Dwarguntha's chest. Gunther's blade snapped as he predicted it would, but only on a killing stroke. His last, and a masterful one it was. The pirates could never reckon this day's victory without counting a terrible cost. Dwarguntha fell, and that was the second thing I saw. He fell, and as he did so, the entire battle seemed to freeze into a shocked moment. The pirates recoiled back, as if the sight of a hero's fall and their own champion's death stole the heart from them. And then I turned to see the third thing, and I knew then why the entire army of pirates had stalled in this moment. The sky was full of ships. Hundreds of them, thousands, the great combined host of Helium and the Tharks, together in a fleet such as no man has seen in the skies of Barsoom in 50,000 years. I do not know how our scout reached the capital in time. Perhaps he found a patrol in their airship and flew like a demon wind to spread the news and sound the alert. I will never know, and do not care. John Carter had come, and that was all that mattered. He had come, and with the greatest force of arms this world could yet muster. Here, to this barren place by a forgotten outpost, here, to fight the last battle. Whoever won this war would rule Barsoom forever. John Carter, warlord of warlords, grown wise in his years, knew this, and he brought such a force that the pirates howled in fear. But they did not throw down their weapons. I will honor them enough to say that, and to say that they made a fight of it that will make songs worth singing. Yet my heart was lifted as I looked up and saw a fleet so vast that it darkened the skies. Or was it my eyes that grew dark? I felt a burning pain and looked down to see the glittering length of a sword moving through me below my heart. I laughed my warrior's laugh, and I slew my slayer even as the air emptied with the barrage of 10,000 airships firing all at once. And the voice of the singer faded, even to his own ears.
4. It was a cold night in Helium. The moons were like chips of ice in the black forever that stretched above the royal palace. John Carter drew his cloak more tightly around him. He was still a tall man, still strong, though great age had slimmed him, slender and hard as a sword blade. He leaned a shoulder against a pillar and looked out over the city. Even this late there was the sound of music and laughter, the sounds of peace. How long had it been thus, he mused? So many nights of so many years without the clang of steel on steel. He sighed, content that his people lived without fear, and yet secretly craving those old days when he and Tars Tarkas rode out to face monsters and madmen and hordes of bloodthirsty enemies. Those were memories of a different world than this. He heard a sound behind him and saw Kestos, the singer, gathering up his scrolls after a night of composing songs for a pending festival. When the young man noticed Carter watching, he bowed.
"My prince," he said nervously, "I did not mean to disturb you. I'm just leaving."
Carter waved it off. "No. Tarry a moment, Kestos. Tarry and entertain an old man. Sing me a song."
"Of what would you have me sing, my prince? Of the spring harvest? Of the dance of the moons above?"
"No, gods, no, Kestos. Sing me one of the old songs. Sing me a song of heroes and battle."
"I know but a few, my prince. I can sing of your victory over the—"
"No, I know my own songs. Sing to me the death song of Dwar Gunther. That's a good tale for a night like this."
The young man looked embarrassed.
"My prince, I am sorry, but I don't know that song."
Carter turned and studied him.
You are so young. To not know the great songs is so sad."
I'm sorry."
Carter smiled.
"No,
Sit, young Kestos, and I will sing you the song. Learn it, remember it, and sing it often. Some songs should never be forgotten."
And as the moons sailed through the black ocean of the sky, John Carter, warlord of all Barsoom, sang of the last charge of the great free riders. And such a tale it was. All of the heroes were tall and handsome, all of the enemies were vile and dangerous, and each of the heroes slew 100 and then died gloriously upon a mountain of their foes. Or so it goes in the song.
The end. Plan 7 from Sin City, a prequel, with apologies, to Plan 9 from Outer Space. 1. Las Vegas, 1957. When she walked into my office, I knew 3 things. She was miles out of my league, even when I was in my league. Someone was going to get hurt, and someone was going to get killed. Probably me. Yeah, her legs were that good. 2. As private dicks go, I'm about 2 blocks left of seedy. Bail bondsmen wince when they see how my place is decorated. But she breezed in wearing a $5,000 mink wrap and a diamond ring that cost more than my house, my car, and my education, with maybe enough left over to buy Arizona. The first thing that bothered me was the mink. This is Vegas, in August. The surface of the sun is where people go to get relief from the Nevada heat, and yet this dame wasn't sweating. She had a dress that was painted over classic lines, honey-colored hair spilling artistically out from under the kind of hat whose message was, if you don't understand why this is the height of fashion, then you're at the other end of that scale. A lizard clutch purse and enough diamond rings to create the world's most elegant knuckle-dusters. Monroe hips, a Mansfield bust line, and eyes you'd mortgage your soul for. I usually had to pay a quarter for a movie ticket to see this kind of class. People like her don't come to me. So I said, "Take a seat." She glanced down at my client chair. Cracked leather, suspicious stains, half a loaf of Skylark white bread, and an issue of Zoftig left over from another case. I started to get up to clear a path for her, but she picked up the magazine, flipped it open to the centerfold, arched an appraising eyebrow, gave a soft grunt of disdain, and used the mag to sweep the seat. She placed the magazine neatly on the corner of my desk and squared it with the edges, very precise.
"How do we do it?"
she asked. I was half a step slow to the plate. "Pardon?"
"This process,"
she said with a vague gesture to my office.
"how do we go about it? What do I say? What do you need to know?"
She had a thick accent. I'm no good with accents, but I figured if her Swedish, said her W's as V's. Normally that would annoy me, but this dame could quack at me like Donald Duck and I'd be good with it. "First thing I need to know is whether you're here by choice or because you got bad directions."
"Choice, Mr. Diamond,"
she said with a faint smile. She had bee-stung lips painted in Mary Magdalene's scarlet. I approved. "Want to tell me who gave you my name?"
"Mabel,
she said. "Pardon?"
I picked you out of the phone book randomly. I flipped a coin onto the page and it landed on you."
"Nice to know you spent some time on it." Another inch of that smile.
"It would probably disappoint us both to spend time wondering if I'd be here if I asked around."
Ouch. "Fair enough," I said. She glanced pointedly around the squalor of my office.
"Lucky Jack Diamond,"
she murmured.
"Lucky?
Yeah, well, the nickname is ironic.
Maybe you should put that in your ad."
People would bring their clothes to press, I said. It took her only a moment to catch the joke. I got a little more of the smile, and I smiled back. Pretty and smart. Nice. I leaned back in my chair. "And you need a PI? Why?"
"I want you to follow my husband."
"And your husband is?"
"Jeffrey Belden."
"Which would make you?"
"Mrs. Belden,"
she said. "Right." I picked up a pen from my desk and tapped the eraser on my green blotter. "You want me to follow your husband?"
"Yes."
"You think he's cheating on you?" She gave me a frank look, and that look invited me to check out the goodies from hair to toes and everything in between.
"No,"
she said in a tone drier than the desert sands.
"I don't think Jeffrey is cheating on me."
"He'd be a damn fool," I agreed, and then gave her my best smile. It's the one that puts the boyish crinkles around my eyes. Women frequently disrobe when they see that smile. My line of work doesn't pay much, but I have a great dental plan. I gave Mrs. Belden the full treatment. Eyes, teeth, crinkles. How she managed not to leap across the desk at me remains a mystery. "So," I said into the ensuing silence, "why do you want me to follow hubby?" She crossed her legs. For most people, that's nothing. A thing they do, maybe to stall, maybe to sit more comfortably. She did it for effect, to make sure I was paying attention. I was. She said,
"I think my husband is selling classified secrets to the Reds.
Suddenly I wasn't looking at her legs. I was staring at her with every atom of my being. "What kind of classified secrets?" I asked.
The atomic kind,
She said. If I had a snappy comeback to that, it burned to ash on my tongue. 3. Mrs. Belden opened her purse and lit a cigarette. She did it to give me time to pick my jaw up off the floor. I cleared my throat. "First off," I said, "how does your husband even have atomic secrets?"
he works for the government.
"He's military?" She blew a stream of smoke into the air and shook her head.
Private consultant. Jeffrey is a mechanical engineer, a very good one. His father built radar systems during the war. Jeffrey was his apprentice, but he's taken his father's work much further.
"Further how?"
I'm not supposed to know exactly what he does. His work is highly confidential, and he is forbidden to tell me.
"But you know," I said, making it a statement. Another long puff of the cigarette. Through the smoke, she said,
One day I couldn't find the clicker for the garage door. Jeffrey has a habit of using it and then shoving it into a pocket or his briefcase, if that's open on the car seat next to him. You wouldn't believe the places I found it. Well, a few weeks ago I went looking for it in his office at home. It was in his jacket pocket, along with the ring of keys.
"Keys to what?" She looked at the burning tip of her cigarette.
Among other things, his file cabinet and desk. He, always keeps those locked.
"Ah," I said. She nodded.
It's awful of me that I even thought of looking, but
I waited. She shrugged.
But it's difficult to live with someone for all these years and know absolutely nothing about what he does. I never get to meet his colleagues, we never go out to office parties, and when he comes home at night he can't talk about anything that happened at work. He talks about sports and asks me about my day. I already know about my life. I want to know about my husband's. Is that wrong?
"I'm a professional snoop," I said. "Guys like me want to know everything about everybody. If you accidentally left your purse behind, I'd snoop through it, and I don't make any apologies about that. So, yeah, I can totally understand you wanting to take a little peek." We sat for a moment with that on the table. She pursed her lips and considered it, then nodded.
Okay,
She said. "Okay," I agreed. "So, what was in the briefcase? What did it tell you about your husband?"
I'm no scientist,
She said.
but I'm no dumb bunny either.
"Yeah," I said. "I get that." Another nod.
From what I could make out, my husband is involved in the research and development of a missile defense system, or perhaps I should say the missile defense system.
I whistled.
Ever since we dropped the atomic bombs on those Japanese islands, anyone with half a brain knows that this is how wars are going to be fought from now on. Not little wars like Korea, but a war between America and Russia, or maybe China. It's all going to be atomic bombs on rockets.
Cheery thought. She gave me a hard look.
It's not a joke, Mr. Diamond. Atomic war is coming. Russia has the bomb now, and you know they're working around the clock to figure a way to build rockets that will carry A-bombs to every major city in the States. China is very close behind them, and they're working like demons to catch up.
"We're miles ahead of the Ruskies or the Chinese," I said.
We are, because of men like my husband and whoever he works with in a research unit at Groom Lake, which is part of Nellis Air Force Base. They are on the leading edge, have no doubt about it. But this is a race, and the communists are very determined. And there are other interested parties who would do anything to know what we know.
Like the Chinese, I said.
Them and others, sure,
she said, staring at me through the haze of blue smoke.
There are always others, Mr. Diamond.
Okay, I said. But I thought your husband was working on missile defense, not rockets.
Don't be obtuse,
she said coldly.
You can't build a defense if you don't fully understand the weapons of attack.
I thought about it and nodded. Which means that your hubby has access to both sides of the equation. The rockets used to carry bombs and some kind of system to... To what, actually? Shoot them down?
I don't know. I don't think he's working on guns or anti-missile missiles. His background is in radar technology.
Maybe it's some kind of jamming thing. Something to make the missile guidance systems go wonky. She smiled at the word wonky.
I think that's exactly what it is. Up until he died, Jeffrey's father was working on what they called the Doten jammer. I'm sure Jeffrey continued his father's work, and I know for sure he was working on it 10 years ago, right after we were married. Jeffrey was originally stationed in New Mexico, but we left in July of 1947 after there were some, problems.
What kind of problems? She waved her hand.
It doesn't matter.
It might. Was he working at another base? Mrs. Belden hesitated.
Yes.
Which base?
Roswell Army Airfield.
I sat back. Ah. She nodded.
You know about it then?
Only what I read in the papers. Something crashed near the base and they said that it was a flying saucer. Then they changed their story and said it was a weather balloon. Sounds like they were drinking when they cooked up both ideas. Mrs. Belden flushed.
My husband was one of the lead engineers on something called Project Mogul. I don't know much, of course, but I think it had something to do with trying to fit the Belden jammer onto a balloon.
Sure, I said, seeing the value of that. You could let one drift into enemy airspace and kill their radar, or maybe tow it behind a plane to make it invisible. That's what your husband was working on down there?
I believe so.
What's that got to do with little green men?
Little gray men,
she corrected.
And I don't know. All of the nonsense about aliens and flying saucers, it's crazy talk.
You don't buy it? She measured out half a smile.
Do I look that dumb, Mr. Diamond?
Not a matter of being dumb. A lot of people believe in flying saucers.
I don't. Now, I don't know if the crash was Jeffrey's fault, but he took it as a personal failure. He was in an agitated state for many months, and even now he refuses to talk about it. He hasn't mentioned the Belden jammer since then.
The papers said that the Army recovered bodies from the wreck.
Yes.
Did they? And if they did, who were they? Little gray men or test pilots? I mean, do balloons even have test pilots?
I don't know for sure that anyone was killed or even hurt,
she said.
That was all a lot of hysteria in the press. All I know is that Jeffrey was transferred out of Roswell a few months later, and ever since then we've been here in Nevada.
That was 1947. This is 1957. That's a long time. And now you think he's selling secrets to the commies?
I fear so.
Jamming systems, not actual atomic bomb secrets.
Yes, and that increases the number of possible interested parties.
Why?
Because it takes a big military to build rockets, but even a small country could build a jamming device if they had the plans. And Mr. Diamond, there are a lot of small countries who are already under communist influence. That man Castro is probably going to take over Cuba, and that's right offshore.
I snorted. Castro overthrow Batista? That's a laugh. It'll never happen. She stubbed out her cigarette.
This is a big universe, Mr. Diamond. Anything is possible. One of these days, mankind may be building bases on the moon.
In science fiction, maybe. She said nothing. Okay, I said. So you poked around in hubby's desk and file cabinets and you found out that he's building gadgets for the government. How's that make him a traitor who wants to sell secrets to the Reds? That's a pretty big step.
Lately he's changed.
Changed how?
He's been acting strange. He works late 4 or 5 times a week, or so he says.
You think he's lying?
I called his office after hours several times over the last week, and he wasn't there. At first it was just a small thing, something I wanted him to pick up on his way home, or to see if he wanted to meet for a late dinner. But his phone just rang and rang. I'd call back a few times and get the same thing.
I sucked my teeth. She gave me a look. A wife look.
Oh, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking that he does have a piece of fluff on the side, and I'm being naive.
Or paranoid, I said. Or both. If you play the odds on what's making a husband come home late from the office a couple of times a week, then I'd put more chips on another dame than selling atomic secrets to the Reds.
Don't you think I know that?
Not sure. When I asked earlier, you invited me to look at all the goodies in the candy shop as if there's no way anyone could stray from a knockout like you. And I'd go a long way to agreeing with you, Mrs. Belden, because you've got more va-voom in your va-va-va-voom than any dame I ever saw. But, I said, holding up a finger before she could interrupt, I've been doing divorce work for years, and I've seen guys from pure idiots to raving geniuses do some damn fool things, and that includes falling for the whole grass is greener thing, even if he's already standing in the Garden of Eden. She narrowed her eyes.
I think there was a compliment in there somewhere.
Or two. My point is,
I get your point, Mr. Diamond, and I assure you that I'm neither insecure, blind, paranoid, or an idiot.
I said nothing. She opened her purse and removed a photo of her husband. Jeffrey Belden was a tall, moderately good-looking man with Poindexter glasses and a lantern jaw. Extremely well-cut suit, a bit of Gene Barry. Even so, he didn't look like the kind of man a woman like this would marry. Maybe he had a big engine under the hood.
I tried following him several times,
She said.
I'd park my car behind the billboard near the gate to the base and then try tailing him like they do in the movies, but I always lost him.
How? Did he spot you and give you the slip?
No, and I don't know that he ever knew that I was following him. It's just that he always left at night, and I suppose I simply lost him in the dark. Every time.
Huh, I grunted. If I follow him, I won't lose him. I'm not the world's greatest detective, but I never lost anyone I was tailing. She nodded. But what if I find he's not meeting Khrushchev or Chairman Mao to sell out the free world? What if he is meeting some dame? She gave me a frank stare.
I love my husband, Mr. Diamond, but I won't be made a fool of.
I can see that. She held my eye for a moment, then nodded.
Call it woman's intuition, but I think Jeffrey is doing something very bad. Something that could harm this country. Maybe the whole world.
The whole world, I said. It's a bit over the top, isn't it?
Atomic bombs and radioactive fallout don't respect national borders, Mr. Diamond. If our enemies start launching missiles, so will we, and then everyone loses. Besides, if you read the paper, you know how things are going. Russia tested its first H-bomb this year, and now they have that satellite, Sputnik. They're already pulling ahead of us in some areas, and they're neck and neck with us in others. We can't afford to let them get the upper hand.
Good point. I folded my hands on my desk. So tell me, Mrs. Belden, why on earth are you wasting time with me and not going directly to the FBI? I'm pretty good, ma'am, but this is way out of my league.
I don't want the FBI involved.
Why the hell not?
I don't want my husband to go to jail.
If he's selling atomic secrets to the Reds, then don't you think he should go to jail?
I love my husband.
I grinned at her. I love my mother. But if she was selling atomic secrets to the Reds, I'm pretty sure I'd find it in my heart to visit her at Alcatraz every Christmas. She shook her head.
I don't want my husband to get into trouble.
You ever heard the expression, love is blind?
Mr. Diamond, I only think my husband is doing something wrong. I'm not sure. I could be totally wrong.
She waved a hand toward the photos.
This could even be part of his job. Maybe these men are consultants, or maybe he's bringing information out to a remote testing spot that's officially sanctioned. My point is that I know something's wrong, and I don't want to lose my husband. Is that so hard to understand?
I guess not, I conceded. What is it exactly that you'd like me to do?
Find out. If he's breaking the law, then I need to know that. And I want to be able to talk to him, maybe convince him to get a lawyer before anyone at the base finds out. Or maybe he can turn over his connection, let the FBI arrest the spies he's been meeting with. Maybe if he does that, he'll get some clemency.
I smiled. You really love him?
Yes. Why? Is that such a surprise?
In Vegas? Sure. In my line of work? Absolutely. Most of the women who sit in that chair are looking for a recipe so they can grill their husbands over a slow fire.
I'm not,
she said, her voice tight and cold.
I want to save him.
If you can, I said. She lit another cigarette and took several long drags on it before she nodded.
If I can.
We studied each other for a while. Her, the rich, beautiful woman with the husband who could be a threat to the free world, and me, a low-rent PI with 3 alimonies, 2 kids I haven't seen since the court said that I was a danger to their well-being, and an office I rented for $50 a month. She needed the best of the best of the best. I shouldn't have been in any phone book she could pick up. Nah, no way in hell this could end badly.
Will you help me?
She asked. I said, sure. 4. She sighed with relief, opened her purse, and gave me 10 $100 bills. I watched as her red fingernails plucked bills off of a roll that would choke an alligator. She placed them across the cover of the Skin magazine. I'm absolutely sure there was a message there, but I didn't much care.
This will get you started,
she said.
I will pay you another $4,000 when you have proof of exactly what my husband is doing and who he's meeting.
$5,000. I knew that my heart was still beating. It was right there in my throat. $5,000 may not be much of a payday to one of the PIs on retainer from the casinos on the Strip, but it was a whole year's income for me, and it was in cash, too, which meant that this was between Mrs. Belden, me, and God. I didn't see any reason to annoy the IRS with needless trivia. She tucked the rest of the wad into her purse. The 10 bills hadn't made a dent in it. I tried not to gaze longingly at it as she snapped her bag shut. Before it closed, though, something fell out of it and bounced on the threadbare carpet. I watched her bend and pick it up. A poker chip. Mrs. Belden considered the chip, her face wistful, and then she flipped it over the desk to me. I got a hand up and caught it.
For luck,
she said. Thanks, I'll take all I can get. I slipped it into my vest pocket.
Jeffrey said that he planned to work late again tonight,
she said. Then I'll tail him and see what's what. Mrs. Belden got to her feet and held up a hand. I stood and shook it. Her handshake surprised me. It wasn't the soft, half-folded clasp women usually give you. Her hand was hard as a rock, but it was also cold and damp. Why? Was that a fear reaction? Was she really that afraid for her husband? It made me feel sorry for her, and it made me like her. I watched her go. The view was magnificent, but my mind was already distracted. Atomic secrets? Russian spies? $1,000. Oh, man, I said to the closed door. I've got to be out of my mind. Then I looked down at the neat stack of Franklins. 5. Private investigators are supposed to be invisible. As one writer once put it, we were the cockroaches in the walls, always there, seldom seen, never invited. I drove out to Groom Lake, saw the electrified gate in a guard booth, drove past it, and found a quiet billboard to hide behind. The billboard threw shade over my car, which reduced the heat by almost 2 degrees. I was pretty sure I could fry an egg on the upholstery. I had a bucket filled with chipped ice, but by 8 o'clock you could use it to make tea. I sweltered. Seconds melted off the dashboard clock and dripped to the floor. Sweat ran down inside my clothes and pooled under my butt. A coyote came panting up to the car, looked at me through the open window as if deciding whether it was worth the effort to try and eat me. Then he lifted a leg and peed on my front tire. If I could have risked the noise, I'd have shot him. I swear to God he was laughing like a hyena while he loped away. The sun began tumbling into the west. A line of cars began rolling past the guard shack, splitting left and right onto the highway. I had a pair of good Army binoculars, and I checked each driver, each make and model. No Belden. Night came on, and the temperature out in the desert dropped like a rock. That always catches people off guard. They think that night in a desert is just like day in a desert, only darker, but you can freeze your coconuts off out on the sand. I drank some of the melted ice, which was now roughly the temperature and flavor of piss, and waited. At 6 minutes past 10, I saw headlights inside the gates, and then a few seconds later, Belden turned his Oldsmobile onto the highway and made a left. Home would have been a right. I smiled, gave him 100 yards of lead time, and then pulled onto the road behind him, my headlights off. Following his tail lights was easy. They were the only lights on the whole road. Otherwise, it was black as the pit. The moon wouldn't be up for another half hour. We drove in silent tandem for miles, then Belden disappeared, just like he did when his wife was tailing him. I slowed to a stop and stared into the darkness, trying to make sense of that. While I'd been baking in the heat all afternoon, I familiarized myself with a map of this part of the desert. The only turn-off roads here were unpaved dirt roads that led to underdeveloped plots of scrubland that even Las Vegas realtors hadn't been able to unload on their prey. Before I made the turn to follow him, I reached over and thumbed open the glove box and fished out my gun, a .45 Colt Commander. I'm not a huge fan of firearms, but I can shoot, and I will shoot if it comes down to a choice between my ass and anyone else's. I shot a couple of guys in Guadalcanal, but I didn't enjoy it. The fact that they were shooting back made me enjoy it even less. My old man, who used to be a cop in Chicago during the bootlegger days, once told me that killing is the result of bad planning. It was great advice. Of course, Dad was part of the gangbusters squad in Chicago, and they killed more people than cholera, so that advice is open to some interpretation. I dropped the magazine, checked that it was loaded, slapped it back and racked the slide. Then I put the safety on and laid it on the seat next to me. God is not always my co-pilot. I touched the gas and rolled forward until I saw the turnoff. You could blink and miss it, so I didn't blink. I followed it, and after a while I realized that Belden was also driving with his lights off. I slowed even more. There was just enough starlight to make out the silvery gleam off of his chrome bumper. Clever bastard, I murmured, easing off the brakes. We both rolled into the darkness. Then he turned again. I pulled up to where he left the dirt road, but there was no side road. Belden just left the road and was bumping over the hardpan. I watched him go about a half mile, then he stopped. I immediately killed my engine because a big blanket of absolute silence dropped over the desert. Nothing, not even the rumble of a truck out on the highway. We were in the exact middle of nowhere. I got out of the car. My gut told me this was a bad idea. The thick wad of Franklins in my pocket kept telling me that they wanted to see more of their friends. The Franklins yelled louder than my gut. 6. I lay like a bug on a flat rock. My car was parked a quarter-mile behind me, tucked into a cleft between some nondescript rocks. Belden's Olds was parked a half-mile to my east. The moon was over the horizon now, and it was a big three-quarter spotlight of white light. It had taken some time to sneak up on Belden and find a vantage point where I could stretch out and observe. I picked a good spot, too. I could see everything. Except that there was nothing to see. Well, nothing of interest. I watched Belden smoke half a pack of cigarettes. I watched him take a piss on a cactus. I saw him check his watch every 30 seconds for almost an hour. I saw him take another piss. Exciting stuff. I felt I was earning every penny of his wife's money. I whiled away the hours by playing with the poker chip Mrs. Belden had given me. It was thick and heavy, filled with luck, I hoped, and I rolled it back and forth over my fingers. Yeah, it was that exciting out there. One thing that was a little weird, though, was that Belden never once looked back at the road. He'd driven to the end of it before pulling off onto the desert floor. I'd pulled off quick and hidden my car. There had been no cars following me, but if anyone was coming to meet Belden, they would have to take the same bumpy road. So far, nothing. Was he being stood up? Was that why he was so agitated? How long would this schmuck wait before he realized that his prom date wasn't coming? Belden lit another cigarette. He stiffened and immediately tossed the cigarette away. I saw why. He was no longer alone. There was a man with him. I used my binoculars to pick out details. The guy was tall, with a receding hairline, dressed in a shiny outfit with buttons up the left shoulder and a belt that looked like it was right out of a Batman comic. All sorts of pouches and doodads. There was a patch on the left side of his chest, a white half-moon with a horizontal lightning bolt. He wore a sidearm and a glossy silver holster, which I thought looked just a little bit, what's the word? Artistic. Like my cousin Davy, who moved to New York to join the ballet. What jolted me, though, was the fact that the man was there, just there. He wasn't there a second ago. I'd bet this poker chip and that whole stack of Benjamins on it. The son of a bitch was nowhere, and then he was there, not 3 feet from Belden. Now, butter that toast with this. Belden didn't even blink when the guy just popped out of nowhere, like he was used to artistic fellows in shiny suits stepping out of thin air in the middle of a moonlit desert. I was not as comfortable with it. I believe I gasped. Or maybe I said something like, "Yeep." Not manly, not creative, but there it is. And it was just a little too loud. Belden and the geek turned and looked up. I was sure that they couldn't see me in the dark, but they stared in my direction for almost 5 seconds. "It must have been a rabbit," concluded Belden. "Perhaps," said the geek, and his gaze lingered on the rock on which I lay for a few seconds longer than Belden's. Then it was all business. "What's wrong?" demanded the geek in the shiny suit. "Why do you look so nervous?" Even from where I hid, I could hear the strain in Belden's voice. "I think they're onto me." "What do you mean?" "I'm pretty sure I'm being followed." "By air, or—" "No, by a car. I've seen it several times. A big Chevy." "Who was driving?" "I don't know. A woman, I think." The geek stiffened. "Describe her," he demanded. "I can't," said Belden. "I never saw her. Not really. Just a glimpse of a face, sunglasses and a kerchief over her hair." The geek considered. "Not one of ours." "I know that, Delos," snapped Belden. Delos? Now the geek had a name, but it wasn't a Russian one, or Chinese. What kind of name was Delos, anyway? Were there Greek commies? I really had no idea.
"Perhaps one of Mr. Gray's associates? I told you that you can't trust them,"
said Delos. He had no particular accent, sounded American, educated, a bit snooty. I had an art teacher like him in school. As I recall, he was a dick, too. I know, but
Did you have your jammer on?
of course. And I checked my car. There are no tracking devices in it, and with the jammer, they can't follow me by air.
Were you followed tonight?
No, I don't think so. It's just that if they are following me at all, then they must know.
They don't know.
They have to at least suspect. Otherwise, why have me followed? Belden snapped.
If they are following you,
said Delos, and from his tone he clearly didn't think anyone was, the dumbass,
then they are probably following everyone involved in top-secret work. That's what they do, Mr. Belden. They are in the business of doing two things, making war and protecting secrets.
Belden didn't look convinced.
Maybe, but...
And you're sure you weren't followed tonight?
Interrupted Delos.
No, I didn't see the Chevy. I didn't see anyone on the road.
I smiled smugly to myself. That's what I told his wife. When I follow someone, they don't know they're being followed. Everybody's got to be good at something, and although my personal list was pretty short, that was up near the top.
Then why are you so frightened?
Asked Delos impatiently.
Why?
Barked Belden.
Why do you think? I'm betraying my country.
No, you're saving your country.
By betraying it.
I thought you were a patriot, Mr. Belden.
Belden got right up in the geek's face.
I am a patriot, God damn it,
he snarled.
This is my world, and I will do anything to protect it.
I very nearly stood up and blew a whistle on the play. I wanted to say, "What?" very loudly, and take a peek at the playbook. I mean, why the hell was a Russian, or possibly Greek, spy playing on a traitor's patriotism? And why did Belden phrase his answer that way? Not, "This is my country," or "This is America." This is my world. Delos sneered at Belden and placed a hand on his chest to push him back.
Then act like a man who wants to see this world continue to spin on its axis, rather than turn to burning dust in the vacuum of space.
Dust won't burn in a vacuum, said Belden. Delos blinked.
I knew that,
he mumbled irritably.
My point is that what you've done, what you've given me, no one will be able to launch missiles. Once we place Belden jammers on our ships, we can prevent anyone anywhere from starting a global thermonuclear war, or any kind of war for that matter. Jamming from space, we will be able to jam every guidance system, every missile command center, every part of the electronics network. We will in fact take the weapons of war out of the hands of all of mankind.
Except for the United States, of course, corrected Belden. Delos smiled. Except for the United States, repeated Belden, leaning on the words. That's what we agreed on. You'd stop any chance of a nuclear war by jamming the weapons of our enemies.
Yes,
he said smoothly.
None of our enemies will ever be able to wage war again. How else do you think we'd be able to conquer you so easily?
The whole world seemed to freeze for a moment. Belden stared at him, his mouth open to say something, but the words died on his tongue. I stared at them both, and I could feel my mouth drop open too. Delos pulled his shiny silver gun. Belden said something stupid like,
What? What amazes me,
said Delos as he pointed the gun at Belden's chest,
is that it took us this long to devise this plan.
What? Belden said again. The man must have been captain of his debate team.
We tried before, you know,
said Delos.
6 tries, 6 failures. This is our 7th plan for conquering the earth, and I think you, of all people, will have to agree that it's a very good plan. We have been trying for a very, very long time now. You wouldn't believe how long. And now you hand it to us. No robot armies, no giant monsters, no bloodshed. You drive out here and hand over your life's work, and now we have a highly effective means of conquering the earth. I...
The stuff I was hearing was insane. Conquest of Earth? Was this geek some kind of spaceman? Even with those ideas banging around in my head, I was already in motion, shimmying quietly off the ledge. But as I moved, I listened, needing to hear every word of this madness.
You should be proud, Mr. Belden, said Delos. You have probably saved millions of lives. Because of you, we won't have to wage war. No one will. You have, my dear sir, effectively eradicated even the possibility of war for all time. A man could die very happy and content with such an accomplishment.
You can't,
gasped Belden, and I could see the silver lines of tears on his cheeks.
I wanted to save us all.
And so you have. There will be no war. The Earth will not become a nuclear wasteland. Your world will survive.
Delos shrugged.
And my people take very, very good care of our slaves.
Belden swelled with fury.
You bastard! I'll never be your slave.
That was never part of my plan anyway,
said Delos, and fired. The pistol was not a pistol. It was a ray gun. It fired a beam of golden light and put a hole the size of a hubcap through Belden's chest. The man fell. Delos never stopped smiling. Until I screwed the barrel of my .45 into his temple and said, "Was this part of your plan, jackass?" 7. This time it was Delos who said, "Yeep." It's a useful word, covers a lot of situations. Drop the rod, space boy, or I'll blow a hole in your head big enough to fly a saucer through. He dropped his gun. Then he suddenly spun like a top and went at me with some kind of alien judo, punching this and twisting that and getting real grabby with his hands. I fired my gun, but the bullet missed. Then Delos and I were on the sand, and who knows, maybe this was the greatest demonstration of dirty fighting the universe ever saw. He knew a lot of nasty tricks, but fuck it. I grew up in Chicago, and Chicago's in the U.S. of A., and we invented dirty fighting. Ask Hitler. Ask anyone. I headbutted him and stuck my thumb in his eye. I introduced his cosmic nutsack to Mr. Kneecap. I spit in his other eye and bit him. For a brainiac from a higher culture, he screamed just like a 10-year-old girl. And then a whole bunch of very weird things happened, kind of all at once. The ground vanished. The desert vanished. Delos and I were floating in the air, surrounded by a weird shimmery light. We were still wrapped up in each other. He was trying to get away, and I was trying to demonstrate all of the many ways you can break the Marquis of Queensberry rules. Then, I was on a metal slab. We both were. Delos was 10 feet away. We were naked. I don't enjoy being naked on metal slabs, not as a rule. It has a bit of a flavor of autopsy about it. There were people around us. Though when I say people, I don't mean doctors and nurses. I suddenly would have preferred doctors and nurses. These people were maybe not even human. They were short. They were gray-skinned. They had really big heads. I mean, not like those retarded kids. What do you call them? Mongoloid? Not like them. These freaks had huge heads and huge black eyes, slits for noses, and little tiny mouths. And they were naked, too. Or maybe they were wearing some kind of skin-tight outfits. Didn't matter. I was naked, and they were all over the place. I tried to hit them, or kick them, or anything them, but I couldn't move. Neither could Delos. He stared at the ceiling and screamed. A lot. The little gray guys with the mongoloid heads had a bunch of weird-looking scientific instruments in their hands. One of them had Belden's briefcase. They smiled at me. I smiled back, hoping this was all going to turn out okay. One of them lifted an instrument that looked like it came out of an ad in the back of one of the girly magazines I read. 8. 2 words. Anal probe. 9. 2 more words. No comment. 10. I blacked out during the process, which was the day's only proof that there was a God and he wasn't a total jerk. When I woke up, I was sitting at my desk. I had my clothes on. My ass hurt. It was still night, but there was a light on in my office. I was not alone.
"Hello, Mr. Diamond,"
said Mrs. Belden.
"I'm glad you're finally awake."
11. How do you start that kind of a conversation? I mean, really, how? What's the doorway into that moment? Mrs. Belden lit a cigarette and watched me as I tried to sort it out.
"What do you remember?"
she asked.
"Our friends didn't tamper with your memory,"
she said.
"You can thank me for that."
I remembered the probe. I wasn't sure I wanted to thank her. I said,
What the hell?
My voice was hoarse. I opened my desk drawer and removed a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses. I poured 3 fingers into each and knocked mine back.
"I don't drink,"
she began, but I picked up the second glass and knocked that back too.
I wasn't offering,
I said. She did not appear to be offended. I studied her. She was no longer wearing jewels and fur. Now she was in a black skirt and matching blazer, with a white shirt and a man's tie. Her hair was tied up in a severe bun, and she wore no makeup at all. She was still a knockout, but in this getup she looked like the world's toughest librarian. I said, "Are you even Belden's wife?" She made a face.
"Hardly."
"You a commie spy?"
"Heavens, no. Try again."
I heard a sound, and my door opened. A man stood there, and behind him were 2 others, all of them in black suits and ties. Despite the midnight hour, they both wore dark sunglasses. The man at the door said nothing, but he touched his watch. The woman who was not Mrs. Belden nodded.
1 minute.
I licked my lips. Who are you people? I met 2 different kinds of spacemen today. Delos and those little gray mongoloid freaks, so... Are you a third bunch?
Do I look like an alien?
No, but neither did Delos.
Fair enough.
Are you?
No,
she said.
We are not aliens.
But you're working with them. With the gray guys, at least. She paused, then nodded.
It's a very old arrangement,
she said.
And one that is mutually beneficial to our people.
To Americans?
Americans, yes. And everyone else.
On Earth?
On Earth.
And Delos? He was definitely one of the bad guys, right?
He was. His kind have been trying to conquer Earth for...
Yeah, I heard that speech. Tell me something that makes all of this make sense. If you already knew about Delos, why did you hire me?
The Belden Jammer.
Huh?
We've been tracking the leak of classified documents for months now, but every time we tried to follow Belden, he vanished. Believe me when I tell you that we have the most sophisticated tracking equipment possible.
Compliments of the gray guys? She nodded.
But Belden eluded us. We realized that he had perfected the jammer, and it also made us realize that he was using it every time he left the office late. Our own reliance on high technology became our stumbling block. That's very frustrating, Mr. Diamond. It's embarrassing.
So is being your patsy.
You weren't,
she said.
Not really. I didn't find you with a random pick out of the yellow pages. We asked around for someone who was exceptional at tailing people and who was not likely to be discovered doing so. It may surprise you that there are a number of people, former clients and even some of your colleagues, who speak highly of you.
She glanced around my office.
You should charge more.
I'll take a look at my rate schedule when my ass stops hurting.
Ah,
She said,
sorry about that. For reasons even I don't know, our grey friends have an enthusiastic interest in the workings of the human colon.
I said nothing, but I had another slug of whiskey. The woman smoothed her skirt. Then she reached into a pocket of her jacket and produced a small item, which she placed on my desk. The poker chip.
This is a tracking device. When I gave it to you, I hoped that it would lead us to wherever you tracked Belden. His jammer runs off of his car battery, so it was a gamble that once he reached his destination he would turn it off. He did, and we were able to pick up your signal. The recovery of the last set of schematics is quite an important thing. We had no idea that Belden had already given Delos so much. If you hadn't trailed Belden, then Delos and his people would be holding all the cards. Not even our little grey allies could save us if their equipment was jammed.
Jeez, I said.
And you may find this interesting,
She added,
but that jammer is years ahead of its time. Belden and his father were great geniuses. Even in its primitive form, the jammer yielded unexpected results on its first trial run.
She studied me, letting me sort it out. I snapped my fingers. Roswell?
Roswell. The Greys were doing a flyover to monitor the test, expecting it to be another failure, but when the jammer was turned on, their electronics and guidance systems went, to use your word, wonky, and their ship crashed.
Too bad, I said, shifting in my chair to take pressure off of my ass. And who the hell are they anyway, and why are we in bed with aliens?
The Greys have been here for many thousands of years,
she said. Why? Did they conquer us already and we've been living as their slaves all this time?
No. They are not a warlike people.
They're not very damn nice.
No, but that's because their understanding of nice doesn't coincide with ours. They are not evil either.
She shrugged.
They are what they are.
And what are we to them? A small shadow seemed to pass behind her pretty eyes.
They are not here to conquer us,
was all she would say. I leaned back in the chair, studying her. You're telling me a whole lot, I said. She said nothing. Why? Are your friends out there going to come in and shoot me?
No,
she said. Are you going to shoot me?
No. No one's going to shoot you. No one is going to touch a hair on your head.
Aren't you afraid I'm going to tell people about this?
Who would you tell?
Who wouldn't I tell? Aliens? UFOs? Attempted global conquest? Conspiracies to overthrow mankind?
Yes, she said. Who would you tell?
Everyone!
And who will believe you?
I started to say something. Instead, I poured another glass of whiskey.
Exactly,
she said. She opened her purse and removed her wad of currency, and I watched her count out 40 $100 bills.
As agreed,
she said. The Franklins looked as confused as I did. Who are you? I demanded. She smiled, and there was a little bit of sadness there, and a little twinkle of devilish fun.
We're the good guys, Mr. Diamond.
I sipped my whiskey. She stood up.
Thank you for your service to your country and your world.
Wait, that's it? You just drop this in my lap and walk off? The woman crossed the office and reached for the door handle, but then she paused and looked back.
Who knows?
She said.
We may call on you again.
Why? Delos is dead and you have the schematics.
True,
she said, drawing it out to load it with some extra meaning.
But Delos's people are still out there. This was their 7th try at conquering the Earth, Mr. Diamond. Who knows how many other plans they have?
She gave me a sly little wink and walked out. I sat there and stared at the closed door, then down at the rows of $100 bills. I poured myself another whiskey, swiveled my chair around, reached out for the cord to yank the blinds up, and sat there, looking out my window at the stars. The end. Clean sweeps. Cloaking devices are science fiction, relics of old Star Trek shows from the last century. We don't have cloaks. We never had cloaks. And we don't have any chameleon circuits or shit retro-engineered from alien craft. What we got is stealth technology. We got LOT, low observability technology. It doesn't make our birds invisible, but it pretty much makes the radar and motion scanners look in the wrong place or misunderstand what they're seeing. We can look like a big black hole in the middle of the sky. We can look like space junk. Or we can look like feedback and sensor static. I always liked LOT, that makes us look like static, because most of the stations have been out here so long that their systems are older than dinosaur shit. Most of what they see 9 to 5 is static. That works for me. It keeps us from getting shot out of the black before we can put boots on the deck. We tune our LOT systems to read the static backwash from the sensor arrays of any ship or base we approach, and then the computers work out some kind of math wizard fluctuating algorithm that matches the normal radio wave crap the universe has been kicking out since the big balloon popped. Surprise always helps, but we didn't know how much of that was on our side. We were hoping to surprise the shit out of them. I'm a big fan of catching the bad guys with their dicks in their hands. Makes for a better raid. Yeah, I know what the press says. World News and Solar AP both have this thing for firefights, which they insist on calling shootouts. Like we're the OK fucking corral. Army PR sends them maybe 6 to 8 mission video files a month, but do the clean sweeps ever make the net? Nope. Not a one, unless it's a goddamn slow news day in the middle of August, where they'll report on crop growth or dig up some old celeb for a Where Are They Now space filler. But somebody pulls a trigger and it's a breaking story. And these news fucks don't give a red-hot flying shit if it's a bad guy, a federal ranger, or one of our boys in free ops that either fires the shot or takes a hit. Bullets and blood, man, that's all they care about. And the bigger the body count, the bigger the ratings. We free ops guys only ever get press if something goes wrong, so we've been on the news, maybe 5 times in 4 years? And of those, the first 3 were during the mine riots following the clusterfuck with the unions. That whole thing took less than a week. Since then, the only time free ops made the news was back in '93, when Captain Lisa Stanley got killed while her team was running down some pirates running the alley between Phobos and Deimos. I mean, come on. Stanley was killed when a stray shot hit an O2 tank in the airlock. I saw the official reports, and the conclusion I drew from it was that she probably tripped on one of the landing sleds the pirates used when they breached the cargo ship. She tripped and popped off a round that bounced all over the airlock until it punched into the O2 tank. It was her bad luck that it was after they'd repressurized. 20 seconds earlier, there'd have been no spark and no death and no story. The news jackasses made her a hero across half the network. My guess, if Stanley hadn't been a California blonde with yabos out to there, the news people wouldn't have run with it as long as they did. That, and they're always starved for action stories. There's only so much mileage you can get from politicians making assholes of themselves or celebrities getting caught fucking the wrong wife. The other time was a real firefight, shootout, between my team and the Chinese hit team that tried to declare sovereignty over the new Tibet colony on Io. That one was a real ball burner. My boys, Jigsaw team, were on point, with Delta, Baker, and Zulu teams on fast follow, and a squadron of jackhammers giving close air support. The Chinese team was sharp. Even I have to give them that. There were a lot of them. They were well-armed, well-trained, and they weren't afraid of us. No, sir, not one little bit. It wasn't until we were on the ground that our forward spotter sent back the news that we were outnumbered and outgunned. Outnumbered like 4-1, which can give serious pause even to a bunch of heartbreakers and life-takers like I got in Jigsaw. But by then, we were in the pipe riding the adrenaline high, breathing the helmet gas that triggered all those useful dopamine receptors. We were juiced and jazzed, and when the smoke cleared, we had a whole lot of dead Chinese. And some dead Tibetans too, but what the fuck could we do? The Chinese hid among the colonists, and they even put Tibetans in their own uniforms. We shot anyone with a red star. Here's how the bullshit plays out, though. First, the press are up our ass all the way through the raid. They're doing advanced stories on the men and women of free ops. You know, those schmaltzy human interest things where they show vid caps of the soldiers as kids, riding horses on the farm, or taking their first EVA at Disney Lunar. Then, during the battle, they're getting video-only live feeds from helmet cams. The brass didn't let them hear our team chatter during the raid. When the battle was over, they spent 2 days canonizing everyone from the first wave of shooters down to the cooks and the galley of the dropship. Heroes all. Then they find out the 3 colonists took fire during the raid. Suddenly we're reckless killers who can't tell a friendly face from enemies. And remember, we're talking Chinese and Tibetans here, and everyone's dressed the same. We're fried by the press. It's a great story. It kept the news feeds buzzing for weeks. Then, when that cooled down, they have the big clanking balls to ask if they can go on every other raid. And the fucking brass, our fucking brass, says yes. Tells you everything you need to know about why I think the whole solar system is populated with nutcases. And yeah, they're on this run with us now. At least we don't have it as bad as the Federals who have that weekly show, Feds. You've seen it, where they do the fly-alongs with the Federals, following the busts with handhelds and helmet cams. Mostly busting, mouth-breathing, bozo drug runners or low-level pirates who are too stupid to know how to dodge a full-lit Federal wagon, broadcasting siren calls on all frequencies. I ask you. We came at the tower with the sun behind us, alternating speed and using lot to look like feedback from old wiring to anyone who was looking. And they were looking, don't get me wrong, but this is a clever stunt and we were pretty good at it. So good that on Jigsaw's last 6 hard infills, we'd had 0 shots fired on either side. Before anyone knows we're even a reality, we're breaching fore and aft airlocks and our jackhammers are suddenly broadcasting sweetlock signals. Bad guys go from thinking they're all alone in the big black to having 20 ugly-ass special operators coming into their ship from ass and mouth and every rocket missile in the catalog cocked and locked from point blank. That's not a time to make a stand. It's a time to trigger an isolated EMP to fry your computer records, drop your guns on the deck, and stand around looking extremely cooperative. That's what we were expecting on this run, too. The mission was routine. The tower was a 40-year-old barrel-style deep space manufacturing plant that used to make ball bearings and alloy pipes before the company went bust. After that, it was empty for 10 years and then got bought by some investors who filed papers saying they were going to retool it for drilling equipment to supply mines on Jupiter's moons. Then, get this, our intel people get a hot tip from some news guy in Solar AP that the tower is really making weapons. Nothing exotic, but enclosed gas shell rifles that you can use in any atmosphere, including 0 atmosphere. Only 2 kinds of people need guns like that, guys like me and pirates. It was a no-brainer to order a raid. You don't let assholes mass-produce guns that you know for damn sure are not going to be used for hunting or home defense. Since the news guys brought us the tip, they got to ride along during the raid. It was a dream come true for them. I didn't like it, but I'm a sergeant. There isn't one person above my pay grade who gives a hemorrhoidic rat's ass what I like or don't like. We planned it right, though, and even did some dry runs on the infill using a similar plant orbiting Luna. My team had the fastest in time, so we drew the lead on the breach. Our tactical bird is a SV-117 Bullet, one of the new frictionless electric motorboats fired torpedo fashion from the bow of the transport. We go in fast and our battery power is used mostly for steering and braking. The bullets are all short range and we were launched from 2,000 miles out. The entire nose package of the Bullet has jamming gear tuned to the transport so we don't ring any bells unless they have towed metal detectors, which this tub didn't. What the tower did have, though, was gravity. It was in a nice spin that suggested a 360 surface pull. Probably not Earth gravity, but enough so that we could run rather than float. I hate floating in a fight. 20 seconds is soft, Doc, our pilot called. We were all ready. 10 tough apes in EVA flex suits armed to the teeth and ready to kick a little gun runner ass. We all had solar AP cameras exterior mounted on our helmets. We also had a ride-along in the person of Alex Tennant, a reporter for Solar AP. He used to be a big shot, but his career had been tanking for years. One of those guys who was never in the right part of the solar system when anything interesting was happening. Bringing the tip about the gun runners was the first big thing to happen to him in 15 years, and he confided to me back on the transport, "You know, Sarge, if I hadn't lucked into this, I'd be burning off the rest of my career doing weather reports on Ganymede." "Lucky you," I said. He was a news guy, so I hated him on principle. But he was okay when the cameras were off. I didn't like having to take him along on a raid, but the brass thought it would look good. A nice PR hit for us. Like we needed good PR. Or any PR. We're soldiers. It's not like we're in the Navy. Nothing glamorous. Grunts with guns is what we were, but like I said, nobody above my pay grade gives a shit what I think, and just about everyone's above my pay grade. So, Tennant got to come along. Luckily, I could switch his audio feed off so I didn't have to listen to him give a blow-by-blow account of all this. We docked without a sound, and the vibration was so soft through our ship that I knew it couldn't be felt in the tower. "Jigsaw in place," I reported. "Zulu in place," came the reply. Our brother team was soft-docked at the other airlock. "Deploy blowback skirt." "Roger that. Skirt deployed." "On my mark," I said. "Everybody watch your fire and check your targets. Nobody dies who doesn't have to. Everybody lives. Everybody comes home." "Hoo-ah," I heard from everyone. The old Ranger cry was always a comfort right before a battle. It came with a hell of a lot of history, and most of that history was of success. By now, the pilots of both bullets would have spinners on the airlock wheels. I counted it down. On 0, the pilots initiated the hard rips that spun the airlock wheels faster than any man could manage it, and the airlocks were literally torn open. The blowback skirts caught any flying debris and shot injected oxygen into the airlocks. Then our hatches swung open and we used the elastic slings to launch ourselves from the bullets into the airlocks. The skirts kept the docking collars pressurized, so we went straight for the inner hatches. "It's locked," my corporal said. "Blow it," I growled. He already had the burst patch attached with magnets, and we wrapped our frag caps around us and did the old duck and crouch as the patch blew apart the internal computers on the hatch. Tennant, the dumbass, tried to get a good shot of the blast, so I had to drag his ass down and under cover. The second the locks were toast, the corporal, Hastings, yanked open the door. "Go, go, go!" I bellowed, and then we were all running into the tower. I led the way with Hastings on my 3 o'clock and Tennant on my 6. He could get some nice footage of my ass if he wanted. Maybe that would help his sorry ratings. The corridor was dark, so I threw starbursts ahead of us. The little marble-sized LEDs ignited and flooded the corridor with blue light. In my helmet mic, I could hear the same process happening for Zulu team. Man, there's nothing like military precision. We raced through one hatch after another, at first finding nothing but huge machinery whose purpose I neither understood nor care. And then we hit the galley. This poor cook looks up, bent over an oven, holding a big tray of pot pies. He had time to say, "What the fuck?" before I kicked him in the nuts and pistol whipped him to the deck. Yeah, I know he's just a cook, but if you're working for the bad guys, then you're a bad guy. At least in my view, and it kept things nice and simple. The adjoining corridor spilled out into a huge manufacturing plant that smelled of oil and sweat. There had to be 50 guys in there. Big sons of bitches, with the arms and shoulders you only get from hauling around pigs of iron or steel in a gravity environment. No space muscles, no flab. Then something really weird happened, and from that point on, everything went to shit. One of the guys, a Turkish-looking guy wearing a kufi, pointed a big wrench at us and shouted, "Pirates!" It all went crazy. The Turk swung the wrench at me with incredible force. The gravity was maybe half Earth, which means a big son of a bitch like him could swing a 30-pound wrench real damn fast. I tried to duck, but the edge of the wrench caught me on the shoulder pad and knocked me 10 feet into a stack of pipes. My gun discharged as I was hit, and I stitched a line of rounds across the floor. I didn't see the bullets hit, but I heard the screams. And then the force of my body knocked the stack of pipes over, and hundreds of pounds of half-inch pipes were hammering down on me. I dropped my gun and buried my head in my arms and curled my body into a ball, but even so I took a hell of a beating. Pipes whacked me in the shoulders and ribs and hips and thighs. The clang was like insanely loud. My visor cracked and I ducked inside my helmet to keep plastic splinters from blinding me. Through it all, I could hear the chatter of gunfire, yells, screams, and the unmistakable thud of heavy metal on flesh. "Shit!" I cursed and tried to worm my way out from under. I had to get back into this fight. Suddenly, two of the bars right over me were pulled back, and I saw Hastings there, crouching down, pushing the bars aside. Tennant, the reporter, stood gawping behind him, his handheld camera shifting back and forth from the battle to me. He hadn't lifted a friggin' hand to help Hastings dig me out. "Sarge!" Hastings yelled. "You all right?" "Help me up," I said. He grabbed my arm and pulled me out from under the pile, and I staggered as more of the pipes clanged and rolled down around me. There was a flash and a bang, and suddenly Hastings was down, his faceplate smashed by a hard-shell flare, and as I watched in total horror, the flare exploded inside his suit. Our flex suits are designed to be fireproof. It's saved our lives 100 times, but the fire is supposed to be on the outside. The flare burst inside his suit, and within a second the suit ballooned out as the fire ignited the oxygen inside and roasted Hastings alive. He screamed like I'd never heard a person scream before, and the expanding gases ballooned his suit for a moment before he fell out of sight. There wasn't a goddamn thing I could do about it. A separate fire ignited inside of me, pure, white-hot rage. Tennant caught the whole thing on camera, and for a moment our eyes met. His face was white with shock, but his eyes were alight. Adrenaline can do that. Even at the worst of times, it can make you feel totally alive. My rifle was gone, lost under all the debris, so I pulled my sidearm. The room was a melee. The gunrunners badly outnumbered us, and two of my guys were down. Dead or hurt, I couldn't tell. The rest had taken up shooting positions behind pieces of machinery, and they'd littered the deck with bodies. But the numbers were bad. The gunrunners had a variety of weapons: flares, hatchets, wrenches, hand welders. No guns, which was kind of weird. They worked in teams, 2 men holding up a big piece of plate steel and moving it forward like a shield, while others crowded behind it, throwing stuff, popping flares over the barricades behind which my guys hid. We had the better weapons, but they sure as hell had the numbers, and I could see more men pouring into the room from the far end. I tapped my comm link and called for a Zulu team, but the unit was dead. It was smashed along with most of my helmet. I pushed Tennant behind me and took up a shooting posture, legs wide and braced, weapon in a 2-hand grip with my arms locked in a reinforced triangle. I fired careful shots and dropped 7 men with 6 shots, and for a moment it stalled the rush of the gunrunners. I was at a right angle to their advance, which created a nice crossfire situation. If I conserved my ammo, we might pull this out of the crapper. Then something occurred to me, and it jolted me so hard that I took my finger off the trigger. "Christ, these aren't gun runners," I said aloud. I turned to Tennant. "Does your comlink work?" He lowered his camera and tapped his throat mic. "No, it's malfunctioning." "Fuck." We have to get word to the fleet. This is a clusterfuck. These aren't gun runners. Look at them. They're machinists, factory workers. That's why they called me a pirate. They think we're the bad guys. Shit! Tennant picked up a length of steel pipe and held it defensively, then abruptly pointed past me. "Sergeant, behind you!" I whirled around. There was nothing. I heard a voice behind me say, "I'm sorry." It was Tennant, and it was an odd thing to say. It was even odder when he slammed the pipe into my head. I could hear the bones crack in my head. I felt myself fall. The taste of blood in my mouth was salty sweet. Sparks burst from the wiring in the machines, and fireworks ignited in my vision. I fell in a pirouette, spinning with surreal slowness away from the point of impact. As I turned, I could see the gun runners renewing their advance on my remaining men. I could hear the chatter of gunfire from the other end of the room. Was it Zulu team? Had they broken through? Or was it the gun runners with Zulu's guns? As I hit the deck, I wondered why the gun runners didn't have their own guys. It seemed strange, almost funny, gun runners without guns. And why had they called us pirates? I sprawled on the ground, trying to sort it out, trying to think. I felt blood in the back of my nose. I tasted it in my mouth. I wanted to cough, but I couldn't. A shadow passed above me. Raising my eyes took incredible effort. I couldn't manage it. But the shadow moved and came around to bend over me. Tennant. His eyes were still wide and excited, but he was smiling, not an adrenaline grin. I've seen those. This was different. Almost sad and a little mean. A little something else, but I couldn't put a word to it. My head hurt so much. Thinking was hard. He dropped the pipe. He bent close. The noise around us was huge, but it also seemed distant, muffled. My left eye suddenly went blind. Tennant was speaking, but not to me. His camera was pointed past me. "As the shootout rages on, the brave men of Jigsaw Team are clearly overmatched by the determined resistance of the gun runners." Firefight. That's the right word. But though my mouth moves, I can't get the word off my tongue. He clicked off the camera and looked down at me. "Thanks," he said. I shaped the words. For what? "Ratings, Sergeant. This is Sweeps Week. This story will get me back in the big chair. I'll be an anchor again before your bodies are cold." "The tip off," I managed. He nodded. "Good PR for everyone. Your bosses will leverage this for increased funding. The militia will get more money for security. And I get an anchor's chair. Everyone's a winner." I was sinking into the big black. I could feel myself moving away from the moment, sliding out of who I was. "You motherfucker," I gasped with what little voice I had. "Hey," he said. "You told me at least 20 times that you never get to pull a trigger, that good soldiering doesn't require heroes. That's a sad epitaph for a career free ops agent." He bent even closer. "I just made you a hero, Sergeant. I just made you a star." I wanted to grab him by the neck and tear his head off. I wanted to stuff his camera down his throat. I wanted to destroy the hard drive and all its images of my men fighting and dying. But I didn't have anything left. So with the gunfire like thunder around me and the screams of good men dying on both sides, I closed my eyes. I knew that he'd turn his camera back on, that he'd film my last breaths, that he'd use my death and the deaths of my men to get exactly what he wanted. But what the fuck? That's show business. Shit. The end. The Vanishing Assassin. It should, I suppose, be entirely appropriate that I sat with my friend C. Auguste Dupin in the gloomy autumn shadows inside the cavernous and, some would insist, haunted walls of the decrepit mansion we shared at number 33 Rue Dunot, Faubourg Saint-Germain. We had been to see a rather melancholy play about phantoms and murder, and it had brought us into a discussion of many things gruesome and bloody. Over excellent wine and a tray of small cakes, we whiled away the hours speculating on the nature of the supernatural. I have a tendency toward belief in it, or at least in some parts of it. However, Dupin will have none of it.
"Spectres are the product of a lack of information," he said as he lit his pipe, "as well as a failure of perception."
"How so?" I asked, intrigued. He took several long puffs of the strong Belgian tobacco he had been favoring lately, blowing ghostly clouds of smoke into the air between our chairs. Small vagaries of wind made the smoke dance and twitch before whipping the hazy tendrils from sight.
"There is an example," he said. "Had you, a credulous man, peered in through a frosted window and beheld the dancing smoke that has so recently departed us, and had you not perceived the meerschaum in my hand, might you not have thought that inside this house, haunted as it is, at least in reputation, you beheld a spectre? And had you been even more credulous, as say our charwoman has demonstrated herself to be on so many occasions, wondered if the two gaunt men who sat with heads bowed together were not, in fact, sorcerers who conjured the dead from the dust of this place?"
"Perhaps," I said cautiously, for I know that to agree or disagree too quickly with Dupin was the surest way to put a foot into a bear trap of logic.
"Then consider the nature of a ghostly sighting," he continued, warming to his thesis. "Most of them occur at night, and of those, many in remote places, darkened houses, dimly lit country lanes, and churchyards, places where proper lighting is seldom provided. Such places lend themselves to morbid thoughts, do they not? Now, additionally consider the nature of the sighting itself. So often there is a sense of unnerving coldness, a perception that something unseen is moving so close that its frigid reach brushes against the perceptions of the witness. Add to this the fact that most spectres are only seen as partially materialized figures or amorphous blobs of light and shadow. Reflect further on the time of day, and let us remember that at night we are often sleepy and closer to a dreaming state than we are at the height of noon." He sat back and puffed out a blue stream. "The evidence we collect are elements of circumstance and a predisposition of mind that not only lacks clarity and is likely fatigued, but which is also shaped into a vessel of belief because of the macabre atmosphere."
"So it is your opinion that all ghosts are merely the creations of overly credulous minds who witness, what, mist or fog or smoke on a darkened night? How then do you explain the movement of these spectres? How do you dismiss the moans they make?"
"I do not dismiss any sounds or movement," said Dupin, "but I challenge the authenticity of the eyewitness account. Let me hear an account of a ghost who appears on the Avenue des Champs-Élysées at 2 o'clock on a May afternoon, and present me with at least 3 unbiased witnesses who have had no time to confabulate, and then perhaps you will ignite a flicker of credulity even in a stoic such as me."
Outside, the wind blew against the house and found some crack in the slate tiles on the roof so that its passage was an eloquent wail, like a despairing spirit. Dupin nodded, as if pleased with the confirmation of his argument. We sat there, smoking our pipes, and listened to the sounds of the old house, some caused by the relentless wind, others by the settling of its ancient bones into the cold earth. Despite the cogency of his argument, we both huddled deeper into our coats and cast curious looks into the shadows that seemed to draw closer and closer to us. Then there was a sharp rap-tap-tap that was so unexpected and so jarring that we both jumped a foot in the air and cried out like children. However, when the door opened, in came Monsieur G., the prefect of the Parisian police, and his presence broke the spell. Dupin and I glanced at each other, aware that we had both been as surely spooked as if we had seen a spectre in truth. We burst out laughing.
"Well, well,"
said G., looking rather startled and confounded by our sharp cries and ensuing gales of laughter.
"Now behold another mystery. Have I come in upon some great jest, or have you two fine gentlemen taken sure and final leave of your faculties?"
"A bit of both, I dare say," said I, and that sent Dupin into another fit of laughter. G. smiled thinly, but it was clear that he was forcing a cordial face. Dupin saw this, of course, and quickly sobered. He waved G. to a chair. "Let me pour you some of this excellent wine," I suggested. "It is a Prunier Cognac, 1835, quite scandalous for a blusty autumn night in a draughty pile such as this, but appropriate for whiling the hours away with dark tales of shades and hobgoblins." However, G. remained standing, hat in hands, nervous fingers fidgeting with the brim.
"Gentlemen," said he, "I wish I could join you, but I am afraid that those things of which you jest are perhaps out, in truth, on this wretched night."
Dupin lifted one eyebrow.
"Do you say so? And what spectral vapours could possibly conspire to draw the prefect himself away from a quiet evening at the Jockey Club de Paris?" "It is a matter of—" began G., but his voice trailed away and stopped. "Wait. How could you possibly know I was at that club this evening?" Dupin waved the stem of his meerschaum, as if dismissing the matter as being of no importance. "A blind man could see it." "Then I am blind," said I. "Please light a candle to this darkness." The briefest ghost of a smile flickered across Dupin's mouth, and I knew from long experience that although my friend can appear both cold and inhuman at times, particularly in his pursuit of the pure logic of observation and analysis, he has a splinter of perversity that enjoys both the confounding of whatever audience is at hand and the later satisfaction of their curiosity. Affecting a face of boredom, Dupin said, "The scandalous matter of race-fixing, which was resolved so satisfactorily last month, was entirely the doing of our good prefect of the Parisian police, one of the more notable applications by modern law enforcement of the value of evidence collection and the science of observing details to discern their nature, rather than forcing assumptions upon them." G. coloured slightly. "I make no pretense to brilliance," he murmured, "and I openly admit to having applied methods I have observed in recent cases with which you were involved." "Just so," said Dupin, without false modesty. "But how does that place Monsieur G. at the club this evening?" I demanded. "It is customary of such clubs to grant special memberships to distinguished gentlemen who have been of service to their organization. It would be entirely out of character for the Jockey Club de Paris to have eschewed that policy after G. saved them from scandal and ruin." "Agreed," I said slowly, taking the point. "It is also in keeping with the policies of such clubs to hold a gathering to celebrate the induction of a new member. In virtually any other circumstance, such a dinner would be held on a Saturday, with much fanfare and mention in the press." "But there was no mention," I said, having read every paper from front to back. "Of course not," said Dupin. "Scandal cannot be advertised. No, such a gathering would be on a night when the club would be the least well visited, and that is a Thursday night, because of the big races in England on Friday. Many of the members would be crossing the Channel. That would leave only the most senior members and the governors of the board in Paris, and it would be they who would want to offer their private thanks. They lavished food and drink upon you, my dear G., and before you ask how I know, I suggest you look to your cuffs, coat sleeve, and waistcoat for evidence." creme sauce, sherry, aspic, and, if I am not mistaken, pâté à choux.
G looked down at his garments and began brushing at the crumbs and stains.
A gentleman who has had time to go home and brush up would never have ventured out in such a condition. No, you came from that robust dinner to the scene of some crime.
But it could have been any club that serves a fine dinner, said I.
True,
admitted Doten.
However, I believe I can put a nail in the coffin with the unsmoked cigar I perceive standing at attention in your breast pocket. It is wrapped by a colorful paper band, which is the invention of Cuban cigar makers Ramon and Antonio Ayones, and although other cigar makers have begun to similarly band their cigars, the Ayones brothers were the first, and theirs is quite easy to identify. These excellent cigars are not yet being exported to Europe, but they are often given as gifts by American horse racing moguls to colleagues in Great Britain and France. It is unlikely anyone but a senior official of the Jockey Club would have such a fine cigar. However, it is very likely that such a prize would be presented to the man who solved the French horse racing incident.
"By God, Doten,"
said G in a fierce whisper,
"your mind is more machine than flesh and blood."
"Ah,"
said Doten.
"How I wish that were so. Machines do not fatigue. They are pure in function."
He sighed.
"There are other bits of evidence as well, both hard clues and inspirations for informed speculation, but I have no desire to show off."
I kept my face entirely composed.
"Nor do I wish to waste any more of our dear friend's time. Tell me, G, what has brought you away from food and festivities and compelled you even further to visit us?"
"Murder,"
said G.
"Murder most foul and violent."
"Ah,"
said Doten, his mouth curling with clear appetite. "But come now," I said. "You earlier spoke of something unnatural." G's eyes darkened.
"I did. And indeed there is nothing at all natural about this case. A man was killed without weapons by a killer who seems to have vanished into thin air."
Dupan's eyes burned like coals through a blue haze of pipe smoke.
"We shall come at once,"
he said. And so we did. We piled into the cab G had left waiting, and soon we were clattering along the cobblestoned streets of Paris. And within a quarter hour we found ourselves standing outside a building which was divided into offices for various businesses engaged in international trade. Gendarmes filled the street, keeping back a growing knot of onlookers and preventing anyone but official persons into the building. As I alighted, I spied an ancient-looking woman swathed in a great muffler of green and purple, leaning heavily on a walking stick. She raised a folded fan to signal our cabby. I paused to help her inside. In a thickly accented voice, she asked the driver to take her to the train station. Doten, who waited for me while I assisted the lady, glanced at his watch.
"She'll have a long, cold wait. The next train isn't for 3/4 of an hour."
"Poor thing," I said. "She was as thin as a rail and already shivering with the cold." But our concern for the old lady was swept away by the prefect, who loudly cleared his throat.
"Gentlemen,"
he said with some urgency, "if you please." Doten gave a philosophical shrug, and we turned to address the building and the knot of police who stood in a tight cordon around the place. They gave G a crisp salute and stood aside to let him pass. However, they eyed us with some curiosity. The prefect did not pause to introduce us, as was well within his right. We climbed 3 flights of stairs to a suite of offices that occupied half of the top floor. There was a cluster of official-looking persons on hand, including several gendarmes in uniform, 2 detectives from the prefect's office, a lugubrious medical examiner waiting his turn, and an ancient cleaning woman who sat shivering with fear on a bench, her face still blanched white from what she had witnessed.
"It was she who alerted the police?"
asked Doten.
"Yes,"
agreed G.
"She heard blood-curdling screams of fear and agony coming from this floor, and knowing that Monsieur Thibaudot was the sole occupant working this late,
She hurried to see if he had done himself an injury. However, she found his door locked. But here is the cause of her greatest consternation. She saw a line of bloody footprints leading away from Monsieur Thibaudot's office, but they vanished mid-stride and were not seen again. The thought that a phantom had come to do cruel harm to Monsieur Thibaudot sent her screaming into the street as if the hounds of hell were on her heels. There she sits now, shaken and frightened half to death. Do you want to interview her?"
Doten stood for a moment in front of the woman. His dark eyes took in her posture, her mean clothing, the nervous knot of her fingers in her lap, and the florid and puffy countenance of her face.
"No,"
said Doten.
"she knows nothing."
The prefect opened his mouth to demand how my friend could be so certain, but then thought better of it and shut his jaws. We both know that Doten would rather say nothing at all than make a declaration which could in any way be impeached. He had observed this woman and summed up everything there was to know about her, at least from the point of calculating observation, and had reached a conclusion that he could defend. He turned away from her and glanced down the hall to where the office of Monsieur Thibaudot awaited us.
"The door was locked, you say?"
he mused. The prefect nodded.
"The superintendent had gone home for the evening, which necessitated that the guards break the door down." "Interesting,"
said Doten. He walked over to where the medical examiner sat.
"Have you inspected the body?"
"I have,"
said the doctor, who was as old as Methuselah and as thin as a stick.
"He is the victim of—"
But Doten raised a finger to stop the flow of words.
"Thank you, doctor, but I prefer to make my own assessments. I was merely inquiring as to whether it is safe for us to examine the victim."
The doctor looked both skeptical and annoyed.
"Yes, there is nothing more of official merit to be learned."
Doten smiled thinly.
"Please remain on the premises, doctor. I may have a question or two for you after I have examined the scene."
"Very well,"
said the doctor in as cold a tone of voice as I am ever likely to hear. Doten moved down the hallway to where a beefy gendarme stood guard before glass-fronted double doors. When the officer stepped aside, I could read the name of the firm written in gold script. Oriental Artifacts and Treasures, Antoine Thibaudot, Proprietor. However, we all stopped 10 paces from the door and cast our eyes upon the floor. As Mrs. Dubois had sworn, there was indeed a line of bloody footprints that trailed from the doors of the murder room and along the runner carpet, 12 steps in all, the intensity of blood diminishing with each successive footfall. "A child!" I cried, pointing to the diminutive size of the prints. Doten did not immediately comment. "Surely," I said, "the blood merely wore off by this point, and that is why there are no further marks." Doten got down on his hands and knees and peered at the last stains.
"No,"
he said.
"The blood on these prints was fading, surely, but there was more than enough to leave a trace for several more paces. Now, consider this print."
He gestured to the last one.
"It is somewhat denser in color than the one before it, with an emphasis on the ball of the foot. Then there is an overlay of the edge of the foot as if it was lifted slightly and placed down again, with most of the weight on the blade." He stood up, shaking his head. "My dear prefect, may all ghosts be laid as easily as this one, and the world will be free of spirits forevermore."
"I don't follow,"
said G.
"The person who left that room stopped here to remove the bloody shoes. When at first bending to remove the left shoe, the killer placed weight on the ball of the right foot. The overlay of the edge was likely an attempt to catch their balance while untying the laces. Once the left was off, a bare or stockinged foot was placed here. See the slight indentation in the nap of the carpet? Standing on that foot, the killer removed the other shoe."
G grunted, seeing it now.
"Come, look at the scene of the crime,"
he suggested.
"and perhaps you can dispel the rest of the mystery as easily as this."
Doten did not answer. Instead, he shoved his hands into his pockets as he followed G inside. I too followed, but stopped nearly at once. "Good God!" I cried.
"Indeed," drawled Doten.
The room was a charnel house. Unless a person is a professional soldier, a slaughterhouse jack, or a member of the police department, it is unlikely that he will chance to encounter a scene of such carnage. I admit that I froze, unable to set foot into that place of slaughter. My heart instantly began to hammer inside my chest, and I felt as though my whole body was bathed in frigid dew. I put a hand to my mouth, as much to stay my rising bile as to staunch a flow of unguarded curses. Even Doten, with all of his practiced detachment from ordinary emotions, seemed to hesitate before crossing the threshold. Only the prefect, jaded and hardened by so many years and so many crime scenes, seemed predominantly unmoved. However, his wooden features might well be a tactic to keep his more human emotions to himself. Despite my misgivings, I shifted around so that I could look over Dupin's shoulder into the room. Except for a solitary figure, the room was entirely unoccupied and thoroughly cluttered. Paintings crowded the walls and filled every inch of space, so that not even a sliver of the wallpaper was visible, and each of these works were in a distinctive Asian style. I am no Orientalist, but I could pick out the differences between Chinese and Japanese artwork, and both were represented here, with perhaps a bias toward the Japanese. Grim-faced samurai, demure courtesans, absurd fish, and fierce demons looked down from the walls and regarded the scene with serene dispassion. The furniture was of the kind called japanned, in which the body of each piece was lacquered in a glossy black, then either overpainted or inlaid with designs of unsurpassed intricacy. There were racks of scrolls, urns filled with hand-painted fans, chests made of polished teak, from which spilled tendrils of the rarest silk. Every table, every cabinet, every shelf and surface was crammed with carved combs, silk kimonos with elaborate patterns, knives and swords, ink boxes, trinkets, statues, and many other items whose nature or category was beyond my knowledge. And all of it was splattered with blood. Streaks and dots of it were splashed upon the walls, scattered across the tops of tables, and ran in lines down the sides of desks. And there, slumped in a posture that contained no trace of vitality, was a corpse. "Dear God!" I gasped. It was the body of a man, but that was all I could tell for sure about him. I turned away, ostensibly to study the walls, but everywhere I looked I saw evidence of the carnage that had been wrought upon this unfortunate individual. Without turning away from the corpse, Doten asked,
"What has been touched?"
G cleared his throat.
"The gendarmes who responded to the alert broke into this room. They hurried to the man you perceive there in the chair and felt for heartbeat and listened for breath and found neither."
"I dare say,"
murmured Doten.
"The officers then made a cursory search of the room, touching as little as possible, but enough to determine that the windows were closed and locked."
Doten turned to him.
"And? I believe you are omitting some facts, my friend. Out with it. In the absence of information, I can be of no value at all."
"It's a queer thing,"
admitted G.
"When the officers entered the building, they held the door for a person who was leaving."
"God in heaven!" I cried. "Are you saying that they held the door so the murderer could exit? Did they tip their hats as well and wish our killer their best wishes? Really, G, this is outrageous." But the prefect was shaking his head.
"No, it was not like that at all. Though in the absence of all other leads,
His voice trailed off, and he looked uneasy and uncertain. Doten said,
"Come on, dear friend, out with it. If the bird has flown, then at least tell me your officers had the good sense to record a basic physical description."
G snapped his fingers to summon a pair of gendarmes. One was as green a recruit as ever I have seen wear the uniform of a Paris police officer. The other, however, was well known to both Dupin and myself. It was none other than Jacques Legrand, a hulking brute of a sergeant whose brutish physique was at odds with the shrewd intelligence sparkling in his blue eyes. On more than one occasion Dupin remarked that Legrand had a real chance in his profession, and we should not be surprised if one day this monster of a man wore the prefect's badge. The sight of Legrand looking so embarrassed and wretched caused Dupin to throw up his hands and click his tongue in the most disapproving manner.
"Come now, Legrand,"
said my friend.
"Surely you will not break my heart by confessing that you let a red-handed criminal walk past you while you held the door?"
Legrand drew in a big breath that made his muscular shoulders rise half a foot into the gloom, then exhaled a sigh that would have deflated an observation balloon.
"I fear I have done exactly that,"
he confessed.
"And am more the fool for even now being unaware of how actions might have played out in a different manner." "Tell me everything," declared Dupin.
"Unburden your soul with every fact you can recall, and we shall see how low you have sunk." Legrand drew in another breath and then took the plunge.
"It was like this, gentlemen,"
he said to us.
"My partner, Rue, and I were on foot patrol, and on such a foggy, cold night many a mugger and footpad is abroad, content that the dense fog and their own mufflers will conceal their identities. Rue and I had made 2 circuits of this district, and we were considering stopping at a cafe to take our evening break."
"What time was this?" interrupted Dupin.
8:15,
said Legrand, who checked his notebook, then his watch.
41 minutes ago.
42, corrected Dupin, absently.
"Your watch is off by nearly 30 seconds.
Legrand colored, but he cleared his throat and plowed ahead.
"We were within half a block of the cafe when we heard a blood-curdling scream. Naturally, we came running and intercepted the charwoman, Mrs. Dubois, who was screaming as if she was being chased by half the devils in hell."
"What did she say?"
"It took quite a bit to get her to make sense, but her story was a simple one. She had finished the top floor and was bringing her mops and buckets down to this floor, the 3rd, when she heard a cry of pain coming from the office of Monsieur Thibaudot. She dropped her mops and came hustling down the stairs, only to find the door locked and a trail of bloody footprints. She tried to open the door, but it was solidly locked, and it is a stout door, as you've no doubt observed. However, Mrs. Dubois heard Monsieur Thibaudot continue to moan and cry out in great agony. Then she heard him die, you might say."
"Heard?" I asked.
"Monsieur Thibaudot called out a name. Then she heard a solid thump. She pressed her ear to the crack and swears that she heard his last breath and death rattle. It was this grisly sound that broke her, and she ran screaming into the streets."
Dupin's eyes glittered.
"Monsieur Thibaudot called out a name, eh?" "Yes, sir. Anagata, or something very like it. A woman's name, I believe, though it is not a name I have ever heard before, and it is not included on the register of occupants of this building, nor in the ledger of visitors."
"You checked?" asked Dupin.
"I did, sir. All occupants' names are engraved on a plaque in the foyer, along with accompanying office numbers and floors. The visitors' ledger is on the desk downstairs. I checked it very carefully while waiting for reinforcements to arrive."
"That, at least, was good police work." Dupin pursed his lips.
"Gata is an unusual surname. If it is a real name, then we should have little trouble locating the possessor of it, for it cannot be common even in Paris. If it is a nickname, then we have some leads. It is the Catalan word for cat and Fijian name for snake. Perhaps there are clues there, for each is suggestive. However, such speculations are far in advance of the information we yet need to collect."
He shook his head to clear his thoughts of such distractions. "Wait," I said. "We seem to have skipped over a vital clue. The person who exited the building."
"Not skipped over,"
said Dupin,
"but left it to its place of importance."
To Legrand he said,
"Now tell me of the person who exited the building as you left.
and explain why you thought it was beyond sense or prudence to detain this individual. Every detail now, spare nothing." "There is little to spare," said Legrand. "As Rue and I approached the building, we saw the door open and a lady stepped out." "A lady?" I said. "Anagata, perhaps." Dupin ignored me. "I do not think so," replied Legrand. "This was no sweetheart for a man the age of poor Monsieur Thibodeau, for this was a crone, a withered old woman, and a foreigner to boot." "Was she wearing a grey cloth coat with a green and purple muffler?" asked Dupin. "Why, yes," gasped Legrand. "However did you guess that?" "It's not a guess," said Dupin. He cut a withering look at me. "My companion here helped her into a cab." Legrand did not look at me. "You said she was a foreigner," said Dupin. "From where?" "Well, she was all bundled up, as you apparently saw, but I spotted her eyes. I reckoned that she was a Chinese or some such. Small, slender, and so wrinkled that I believe she must have been 100 years old. Frail she was, and she needed to lean heavily on a carved walking stick." Dupin stood considering this for many long and silent seconds. He cut a look at me. "You were closer to her than I. Did you see her eyes, and can you confirm that she was Chinese?" "I did see her eyes, though briefly," I admitted. "But I cannot tell from those if she was Chinese, Japanese, Korean, or any of countless Orientals. They are all of a piece to me." Irritation flickered across Dupin's face. "That may be a dead end in terms of apprehending the killer, but surely, Legrand, you had to make some connection between an Oriental woman and the nature of Monsieur Thibodeau's business." Legrand swallowed. "To tell the honest truth, sir, I thought she was another charwoman. She was dressed in rags except for that scarf and walked hunched over. In any other circumstance I would have offered her my arm and escorted her to a public house or fetched her a cab." "Too late for that now." Dupin looked even more disgusted. "Let us leave that for the moment. Is there anything more you can tell me?" The big sergeant shook his head, and Dupin dismissed him with bad grace. When he was gone, Dupin snarled, "Had that been an old man leaving the building, even a dotard or a cripple, I have no doubt Legrand would have detained him without thought. But he, being a big and powerful man, can barely imagine anyone but a similarly large person committing an act of such shocking violence. It is a blind spot that may hurt his career and may have prevented us from easily solving this case. Bah! It is my curse that I am so often disappointed by believing in the potential of a person only to find them as flawed and shallow as the rest of the herd." "Surely not," I began, working up some heat in protest to my friend's words, but he dismissed me with an irritable wave of his hand. I bit down on the rest of my words, and they left a bitter taste on my tongue. Dupin stalked back toward the murder room, leaving G and I to exchange helpless looks. With raised eyebrows, we followed. Dupin walked past the elderly doctor without comment. He once more examined the bloody footprints and then, nodding to himself, entered the room. He was careful not to step on any of the spilled blood, but that care limited him, for the blood was everywhere. He moved slowly through the chamber, speaking in a low murmur as he assessed each item therein and offered commentary to construct a scenario. "That Monsieur Thibodeau was an Orientalist is evident," said he. "Except for ordinary items of daily convenience, pens, ink bottles, and such like, there is nothing here of local or common manufacture. It is likewise evident that Monsieur Thibodeau was an antiquarian of some note. These premises are not inexpensive, and his stationery and calling cards are of the very best quality. Likewise his clothes, what we can see of them. He was a man of expensive tastes and deep pockets." He did a complete circuit of the room, peering up and down, sometimes bending quite low to examine one of the countless artifacts on display. "It appears that the late Monsieur Thibodeau was more than a mere Orientalist, but rather a specialist within that field, for virtually everything here, with the exception of a few paintings, is of Japanese origin." This statue of sacred cranes is well known and is surely the work of H., a noted sculptor from the city of Osaka. There are a number of tansu chests of great value. And see these Satsuma vases? Koimari and Kutani-covered bowls, Oribe tea bowls, Usuki stone Buddhas, as well as stone mirrors, jade combs, and many swords.
"But what of it?"
demanded G.
"Please, my friend. I did not bring you here to inventory the possessions of a murdered man, but to offer advice in the discovery of a murderer."
The fact that some of these items are even here is surely at the heart of this gruesome matter, said Dupin. See here, this tea-leaf jar with the design of wisteria? This is a treasure from the 17th century, and it belongs in a museum. I would venture the same holds true of this fine Akikusamon bottle. This is authentic Heian period, later 12th century. I know for a fact that this is considered a national treasure of Japan.
How then is it in the collection of a Parisian dealer of antiquities?
The fact that the man who came to be in possession of these items could not under any circumstances legally own them is undoubtedly tied to the cause of his death.
"Then Thibodeau was not but a common thief,"
exclaimed G. Oh, I dare say he was much more than a common thief. More likely a trafficker in stolen items. A most elite fence, for these items are unparalleled in quality, and more to the point, they are treasures of historical and cultural significance. Wars have been waged over the possession of items such as these. Even now Japan is slowly being torn apart by cultural changes, with one faction wanting to move toward a more modern culture, with fractured and fuming Europe as its model, while the other desperately tries to hold on to the ancient values of the samurai traditions. Look at these items, gentlemen, and you will see their delicacy and exotic beauty. But to the Japanese on both sides of the cultural rift, these are emblematic of the spirit of the people.
"How came they here?"
asked the prefect. Dupin picked up an ornate knife and studied the fine weaving of black silk thread around its handle. Certainly it is not the traditional faction who would let such items leave Japan. No, gentlemen. This is part of an insidious plan by the modernists, the groups who want to see the old remnants of the Tokugawa shogunate torn down and replaced by a more corporate and capitalist structure. To that end, they have engaged many of the world's greatest thieves as well as traitors from within the oldest families. Bribery and promises of power are the grease that allows the machinery of theft and exportation to work. But why? Bowls and urns and hair combs? Why steal trinkets and baubles? I asked. What possible political value could they possess? Dupin cocked an eyebrow. Imagine, if you can, that a similar schism were taking place in, say, Great Britain. What if dissidents were spiriting away the crown jewels? And, closer to home, imagine that thieves were walking off with the splendors of Versailles, and doing so in a deliberate attempt to inflict a wound upon the heart of all that we hold dear as Frenchmen. That is the scope of this. That is what is at stake for the Japanese. The treasures of that nation are being looted, and men like our dearly departed Monsieur Thibodeau are the parasites and Shylocks who both assist in these crimes and profit handsomely from them. We looked around the room, seeing it afresh. I could very well now understand the vehemence of the attack, the degree of harm, and the apparently protracted length of the assault spoke to a passion fed by love of country and horror at the rape of an ancient culture. I found now that I could look upon the corpse with less revulsion and more with a particular repugnance and a total lack of sympathy.
"We are still no closer to solving the mystery of who committed this murder,"
said G.
"I cannot ignore it because I may sympathize with the murderer's cause. That is for courts domestic and likely foreign to decide. And furthermore, I am still at a loss for how the murder was committed. I dare say the killer took his weapon with him, but I cannot deduce what that weapon may have been." "Weapons,"
corrected Dupin, making the word clearly plural.
For I perceive that a great many of them were used in the work that was done here. But which ones? I see swords aplenty, and even spears, but these are not the cuts and slashes of those weapons?
No. Dupin's tight mouth wore a strange half-smile.
There is a certain poetry to this carnage.
In God's name, how? I demanded.
Gentlemen,
he said, holding wide his arms.
We are surrounded by the murder weapons. Can you not see them? They have been left behind for us to find, for anyone who had the eyes to see.
G and I looked around, and though we saw blood glisten and drip from virtually every object and surface, there did not appear to be any particular weapon on display, except those fashioned for that purpose, but they had inexplicably been eschewed by the killer.
I cannot see it,
confessed the prefect.
I am all at sea. Then let logic bring you safely into shore,
said Dupin. He pointed to a particularly deep gouge on Monsieur Thibaudot's scalp.
To identify an object used in a murder as creative as this, we need to broaden our minds from thoughts of those things created to be weapons and to those which were not, but can nevertheless be used to accomplish harm.
He turned and picked up a fragile vase with one hand, and then the painted wooden stand with the other. For all of the delicacy of the vase, the stand was a sturdy piece of work. Dupin held it up for our inspection, and with our wondering and horrified eyes we could see a smear of blood in which floated a few fine hairs that were a match to the deceased, and the corner of one leg was an equally perfect match to an indented scalp wound.
"He used a vase stand?"
gasped the prefect.
"Oh, yes. A vase stand is but a piece of wood, after all, and wooden weapons have such a rich history, wouldn't you say?"
While we continued to gape, Dupin pointed out several other objects, matching each to a specific wound or series of wounds. Decorative chopsticks made from bone had been used to create dreadful, rough punctures. The steel ribs of a lady's court fan had been used to create dozens of shallow slashes. An ink block had clearly been the cause of a broken nose and crushed brow. On and on it went, until Dupin had proved that we indeed stood within an arsenal of deadly weapons, though each appeared to be utterly fragile and lovely.
If we suspected that the murderer was one of the modernist Japanese, then I would have expected to find bullet wounds or the marks of military knives, but no. The fact that commonplace objects, or rather those things never intended for such grim purposes, had been used, reinforces my supposition that the murderer is indeed devoted to the ancient samurai houses of Japan, but not, I am certain, a samurai himself. "Please explain," said G, "so that I may begin composing a rough description for my men." The samurai and their retainers are highly skilled in many fighting arts, not least the sword. But some of these sciences are more obscure, their nature and use coveted by the great families. One such art is called Hadaka Korosu, and it translates roughly to the art of the naked kill. The name refers not to a person being unclothed in combat, but a fighting art used when the samurai has no sword. The Japanese, particularly the samurai, are less mystical than the Chinese in that they endeavor to see things plainly for what they are, and so to them a piece of wood is a potential weapon, whether it has been fashioned into a club or made to support a delicate vase.
"Astounding," said I.
"Subtle,"
said he.
"Look around and you can see how many of these things are surrogates for blades, for truncheons, for garroting wires, for weapons of combat, or, as clearly in this case, for weapons of torture, punishment, and execution."
He looked down in disdain at the body.
"Think about the care, the patience, and the risks taken by the killer, gentlemen.
Even a retainer of a samurai family would be skilled with every kind of knife. He could have made this quick and silent. Instead, he chose to use the stolen artifacts as the weapons of this man's destruction. This was a performance of murder, a symphony of slaughter, make no mistake. And think of how poetic that is.
Poetic? I asked, aghast.
Oh, yes,
said Doten.
And in its poetry the killer is revealed. Remember the words the dying man cried aloud.
You mean the name, said the prefect. Anagata.
No, my dear friend, I do not, for I would doubt that Monsieur Thibodeau ever knew the name of the assassin sent to kill him. My guess is that he arranged a late meeting with what he thought would be a client, someone bringing a new and illegal piece to him that he could never receive during regular hours. The caller was almost certainly a woman.
G snapped his fingers. The old Oriental woman Legrand encountered. Surely it can't be she. These wounds are the work of a powerful hand.
Doten nodded.
And yet Thibodeau would never feel quite safe meeting a Japanese man after hours, not with the likelihood of a samurai spy hunting for a broker such as he. No. Thibodeau expected to meet with a woman, but her name was never Anagata.
Then what? I demanded.
Thibodeau did not, with his last breath, name the killer, but cried out in surprise as he discovered the killer's secret. In the extremis of the situation, Thibodeau realized that it was, after all his precautions, a man who assailed him, but a man dressed as a woman, and therein is the answer to his outcry. Not Anagata, gentlemen, but Onagata, a Japanese word from the world of kabuki theater, which we have all seen upon the stage even here in Paris. Like Shakespeare of old, kabuki does not allow women to perform, and instead young men are chosen to play the female roles, and the word for such a role is onagata. Our killer revealed that he was a man, and quite a lethal one, during the act of murder, but by then Thibodeau was doomed.
The prefect gaped at Doten for a long moment, but he did not dare question my friend's veracity, or to try and poke holes in the chain of his logic. Doten seldom speaks unless he is sure, even when other men witness the same evidence and are far less certain. Then G bellowed for Legrand and his other gendarmes and bade them hurry to the train station to arrest anyone they met there, an old woman, an old man, or even someone dressed like a Buddhist monk, for a kabuki actor could adopt any of 1,000 roles and play them with surpassing conviction. Doten hooked his arm in mine, and we went down the stairs and out into the cold, foggy night. Your knowledge is in itself remarkable, I told him, but it is in the way that you allow disparate facts from such vastly different closets of your mind to find their way together that continues to astound me.
It is the result of a practice of logical thought,
he said.
It is not a comfortable discipline, for it is very demanding, and it can sour one to many aspects of ordinary social behavior, but it has its advantages.
I removed my pocket watch and looked at the time. Oh, dear, I cried. I doubt that the gendarmes will have time to intercept our suspect before she, or should I say he, boards the Continental Express. Doten merely shrugged. I shot him a look. Surely this distresses you. A criminal, one who you alone have found out, is likely to slip away. He turned and looked at me with eyes that were as deep as wells and equally dark.
Are you, my friend, so inflexible in your views of justice that you view this man, this deadly actor, as nothing but a common criminal, one to be hunted, tried, jailed, and hanged?
Before I could answer, he added,
Certainly the actor is an assassin, and surely he is operating on French soil without permission, and in ways that contravene so many laws. But tell me, and speak true from your heart, if you were he, would you consider yourself a criminal or an agent of justice? Has not the true criminal of this drama already been found, tried, and executed?
I formed a dozen arguments against so radical a notion, but before I could barrage Dupin with any of them, he turned and began walking along the avenue. Within seconds, the darkness and the fog had turned him into a spectre, and then he was gone entirely. I, on my part, was left standing there with his words ringing in my ears, and no clear opinion painted on the walls of my heart. The end.
This concludes the reading of Strange Worlds, short fiction by Jonathan Mayberry. The Things That Live in Cages, copyright 2013 by Jonathan Mayberry. The Death Song of Dwarguntha, copyright 2012 by Jonathan Mayberry. Plan 7 from Sin City, copyright 2012 by Jonathan Mayberry. Clean Sweeps, copyright 2011 by Jonathan Mayberry Productions, LLC. The Vanishing Assassin, copyright 2013 by Jonathan Mayberry Productions, LLC. This book was read by Ray Porter. This unabridged recording was published by arrangement with Harvey Klinger Incorporated and was produced in 2015 by Blackstone Audio Inc., which holds the copyright. Neither this recording nor any portion of it may be reproduced or used for any purpose without prior written authorization from Blackstone Audio Inc. If you would like to obtain a monthly update telling you about new releases, call 1-800-SAY-BOOK. That's 1-800-729-2665. For a complete listing of our titles, visit our website at www